The winter morning of 2000 began with an unusual disturbance on Highway 10, leading into the town of Casselton, North Dakota. 5 unmarked police cars quietly turned off the main road and stopped in front of an old wooden house, standing isolated in the middle of a snow-covered field. The few neighbors stood behind fogged-up window frames, silently watching as cold case investigators positioned themselves around the property as if afraid of disturbing something that had lain dormant for far too long. Inside the house, 71-year-old Diana Mercer was preparing a simple breakfast, a routine she had maintained for many decades, since life in this small town seemed to have returned to normal. The wall clock had just struck 6:58 a.m. when a series of urgent knocks shattered the familiar quiet. Diana Mercer, Cass County Sheriff's Office. We need to speak with you about the 1953 disappearance. Later, one investigator recalled that the woman's hand paused slightly on the handle of the teapot, but her face remained eerily calm, as though this moment had been awaited for nearly half a century. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In January 1953, the North Dakota plains were blanketed by thick layers of snow, with biting north winds cutting across the endless fields surrounding the small town of Wheatland. Population just over 300, where laws operated slowly in a society still heavily reliant on community trust and limited intervention from post-war law enforcement. In that context, 2 individuals regarded as pillars of the local community: 34-year-old Thomas Brandt, a railroad technician on the Fargo-Bismarck line, and 31-year-old Evelyn Hart, a newly arrived teacher in Casselton who had quickly earned respect, were seen as a calm, discreet couple who never caused trouble and rarely became involved in any conflicts. Thomas had recently finalized his divorce from his ex-wife Diana Mercer, who lived in Fargo, after years of simmering disputes. Everyone in town knew the split had not been amicable, but both parties still maintained minimal contact regarding shared property and legal paperwork. On the evening of January 17, Thomas drove his familiar green Plymouth to take Evelyn to the dance at the Casselton Community Hall, a popular weekend event for residents of nearby towns. Witnesses noted that they left the hall around 11:00 p.m., with the weather still stable despite the dropping temperature. That was the last time anyone saw them. The next morning, Thomas's family did not receive the usual call reporting that he had safely returned to Wheatland after his shift. By noon, Evelyn also failed to appear at the teacher's boarding house as she had promised. When several relatives tried to make long-distance calls to Casselton and Fargo, no one answered. They began contacting familiar locations: the railroad office in Fargo, the boarding house where Evelyn sometimes stopped. Close friends in Wheatland all replied that they had not seen the couple since the previous evening. By afternoon, one of Thomas's family members drove along Highway 10 themselves to check for any unreported accidents, but found no signs of a crash scene or any vehicle stopped unusually. The prolonged silence, inconsistent with Thomas's habits and Evelyn's strict schedule, led the family to conclude that this was no longer a simple case of delay. After systematically checking every usual destination and confirming that Thomas had not shown up for the morning shift and Evelyn was absent from her scheduled classes, the family had to face the most frightening possibility. This silence was no ordinary delay. As dusk fell over Casselton on January 18th, they agreed that the two had vanished without explanation and together went to the town police station to file a report, ending all desperate self-help efforts. The missing persons report was received at the Casselton police station late that afternoon, and within hours, the file was forwarded to the duty officer responsible for cases involving residents of Wheatland and Casselton. Police began by recording complete personal information on Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart: occupations, work schedules, vehicle, travel habits, recent relationships, and any factors that might relate to leaving their residences without notice. Thomas's family provided the first statements, noting that Thomas habitually called immediately upon arriving in Wheatland and had never missed doing so for years. They insisted that his failure to report in, even if late, was highly unusual. From Evelyn's side, police collected statements from 3 colleagues at the Casselton teacher's boarding house, all confirming she had said she would return to school the next morning to prepare lessons. Evelyn's close friends also stated she had no plans to go anywhere beyond the community hall dance. Based on this information, police began constructing a timeline. The last sighting of the two was around 10:50 to 11 p.m. at the east exit of the Casselton Community Hall. A server remembered Thomas holding Evelyn's coat as they stepped outside just as the wind and snow began to intensify. From there, police determined the most logical route Thomas would have driven, leaving Casselton southward onto Highway 10. then continuing west back to Wheatland, a familiar route he traveled regularly after shifts. The distance between Casselton and Wheatland was just over 15 miles, normally taking 25 to 30 minutes in winter night conditions. Next, police asked the family about stops Thomas usually made during evening drives: a small gas station near Enderlin Junction, a late-night diner beside the tracks, and a telegraph station where he sometimes sent reports to the Fargo-Bismarck line when issues arose. All these locations were checked on the morning of January 19th. The gas station attendant had not seen Thomas that night. The diner recorded low customer volume and no match to the couple's description. The telegraph station had no record from Thomas's technician number. For Evelyn, police checked possible post-dance stops such as a friend's house, the town bookstore, or the teacher's boarding house. No one had seen her after leaving the hall. The absence of any reasonable stops led police to conclude that the couple's timeline extended at most to the moment they left the hall. After that, there was a complete void that could not be reconstructed. After cross-referencing all statements, authorities concluded there was no basis to believe they had voluntarily left the area, given their work schedules, personal responsibilities, and communication habits all indicated plans to return home that night. Failing to appear at their residences and not making contact for over 24 hours was considered a serious red flag under 1953 standards. From this assessment, police officially opened an investigation, classifying the case as high-risk missing persons, and began systematically checking the entire Casselton-Wheatland route. On the morning of January 19, 1953, after completing the timeline and ruling out voluntary departure, Casselton Police, in coordination with support from Cass County, immediately deployed search teams along the full length of Highway 10 between Casselton and Wheatland, treating it as the primary route to check first due to its logical fit with Thomas Brandt's habits. The search was divided into small groups, each assigned a specific segment to ensure no detail was missed, especially in windy, heavily snow-covered conditions where evidence could be quickly erased. They began at the southern exit of Casselton, where Thomas's Plymouth was believed to have passed right after leaving the dance, and proceeded westward. First, police carefully examined both snow-filled ditches along the route, because in winter vehicles could slide off the road and be buried without obvious signs. Searchers used shovels, probes, and high-powered flashlights to probe deep drifts but found no metal objects, glass fragments, or any trace of a crashed vehicle. Next, they focused on known accident black spots, including 2 sharp curves before the intersection with Farm Route 12 and the area around the culvert bridge over Maple River. These locations were prioritized because vehicles that lost control could easily plunge down embankments or become trapped under thick snow. However, despite harsh weather, the road surface showed no skid marks, brake marks, or any disturbance consistent with a vehicle traveling the previous night. At the Maple River Bridge, they found the snow layer intact, undisturbed by tire tracks or footprints, meaning no vehicle had left the bridge in an unusual direction during the night of January 17 or morning of January 18. They also checked beneath the bridge, where vehicles sometimes fell without leaving surface evidence, but the river was fully frozen with no cracks or depressions. The search then moved to elevated sections where vehicles could roll or slide and be covered by snow. Walkers spread out along the road, checking gaps between guardrails and using probes on deep snow. Another group examined low shoulders and roadside brush, where metal or glass fragments from collisions might remain, but the survey found nothing unusual. Police also had a technician simulate the damage a Plymouth might cause to snow or roadside structures in a serious accident, but the simulated results did not match the actual condition of Highway 10. To be thorough, the search expanded several hundred feet beyond the shoulders, especially in areas where strong winds created unusual snowdrifts that could cause vehicles to veer off. Even with the expanded radius, no tire tracks newer than 24 hours were found, except for those of routine daily traffic. By noon on January 19th, the team had covered nearly 70% of Highway 10 and reported no evidence suggesting Thomas and Evelyn had been in an accident on the road. To ensure completeness, they finished the remaining portion that afternoon, but the situation remained unchanged. No debris, no skid marks, no drag marks, no unusual snow compression, and no sign of an abandoned vehicle. The complete absence of any accident indicators along the entire Highway 10 forced police to take the necessary next step: rule out disappearance due to a traffic accident on the main route. This meant the most logical and probable hypothesis based on local experience no longer fit the facts, compelling authorities to prepare for more complex possibilities to continue the investigation. After ruling out an accident along the entire Highway 10, Casselton Police and Cass County Support shifted to expanding the search to secondary roads and farm routes connecting Casselton, Wheatland, and surrounding areas. These were often poorly maintained dirt roads, lightly traveled in winter, and possible locations where a vehicle could have left the main route unnoticed. To determine the exact areas to cover, police used 1953 topographic maps from the Land Management Office showing dirt roads, tractor paths, private farm access lanes, and temporary agricultural routes. The map was spread out at the Casselton station and divided into 3 main zones: southern roads paralleling the railroad from Casselton, northern roads from Wheatland leading to abandoned 1940s farms, and dirt roads between the 2 towns mainly used for crop transport. First, search teams moved to dirt roads branching south from Highway 10, where 2 large farms and an abandoned barn stood. They examined road edges, wind-blown snowbanks, and terrain prone to tire slippage. However, recorded tire tracks were old and matched agricultural trucks, not the Plymouth Thomas drove. Next, they turned to northern routes from Wheatland. This area featured many trails leading deep into fields, directly exposed to cold western plains winds that blew snow into thick layers, obscuring vehicle traces. Teams walked in clusters, spaced tens of meters apart, to closely observe snow ruts and depressions. They noted some slight depressions possibly caused by animals or natural snow settling, but no signs of motorized traffic during the suspected time frame. During the sweep, police marked several suspicious points, mainly sections partially buried by deep snow or leading to rarely used areas, the most notable being a trail east of Wheatland with a compressed snow track, several meters long. Closer inspection determined it was a snow sled track from a nearby farmer, unrelated to the disappearance. Other areas, such as collapsed barn entrances, old farmwood piles, and trails near small creeks, were also checked, but yielded similar results: no fresh tire marks, no metal objects, no glass fragments, no footprints, and no evidence indicating Thomas and Evelyn had passed through. Searchers also examined accident-prone dirt sections, sinkies, slippery slopes, or snow-covered deep holes, but still found no Plymouth or characteristic signs of a vehicle leaving the road. After more than a day of sweeping the entire secondary road system between Casselton and Wheatland, the team concluded its report: no vehicle, no victims, and no signs they had left the main route via side paths. The lack of any fresh traces left police with the interim conclusion that the couple had not encountered trouble on back roads, further narrowing early hypotheses about off-route accidents. With no leads from main or secondary roads, the investigation was forced to shift toward other directions where the cause of disappearance might no longer involve random accidents. While search efforts gradually narrowed possibilities after comprehensive checks of main and secondary roads yielded no useful traces, Casselton police received new information on the morning of January 20, 1953, when a farmer living east of Wheatland voluntarily came to the station to report that on the night of January 17, roughly coinciding with when Thomas and Evelyn left the Casselton Hall, he had heard a high-speed vehicle engine and arguing voices carrying across the field. According to the witness, shortly after 11:07 p.m., while checking livestock before closing up, the northwest wind carried clear sounds, a sudden revving engine, followed by what sounded like 2 people arguing loudly, then abrupt silence. In the open plains of North Dakota, sounds often traveled farther on windy nights, so the witness's account was deemed consistent with field conditions. Police immediately conducted a more detailed interview to determine the direction and approximate distance of the sound. The witness pointed southeast of his farm, where a system of trails ran parallel to Maple River and intersected a rarely used dirt road. Cross-referencing with a 1953 topographic map, police realized the described area lay outside the zones, searched the previous day partly because it was large private land without clear access, and partly because the trail did not appear on standard traffic maps, but only on agricultural survey maps. This made the area a new subject for evaluation. The witness also stated he saw no headlights, only heard sounds, so the distance could range from several hundred meters to over a mile. Using the map, police delineated a search test based on the wind direction recorded at the Fargo weather station on the night of January 17th, northwest to southeast, strong enough to carry sound in a relatively straight path. They then drew a wide arc on the investigation map, encompassing trails leading toward Maple Ridge Creek, marking several low-lying topographic points where sound could have echoed. After analyzing the sound direction, police added a new search branch to the overall investigation diagram. the dirt trail running from the old Kestrel family farm to the sparse woods bordering Maple Ridge. This route was almost unused in winter except by a few scattered households. The search team was redeployed to this area that same afternoon of January 20. Deep snow made identifying traces difficult, but the team still checked segment by segment, using measuring tools to identify possible tire compressions. The terrain was relatively complex. Some trails were completely buried, others wind-scoured into unusual deep ruts. However, near the intersection with the trail toward Maple Ridge, searchers discovered a lightly disturbed snow area, possibly caused by engine heat melting surface snow into patchy patches before refreezing. Though not conclusive evidence of a vehicle stopping there, it stood out compared to surrounding areas. Police logged the location in their report and marked it on the investigation map as a point requiring deeper inspection. During the search, they also probed 2 snow ruts leading into a depression near the creek, as these were places a vehicle could become stuck or buried. However, except for a thin ice crust on the surface, no metal, glass, or mechanical traces indicated a vehicle had slid there. The team continued checking suspect areas mentioned by the witness, including the gentle slope along the Maple Ridge rise, sometimes used as a shortcut by locals. But wind-hardened snow made the work difficult, and collected signs remained inconclusive. After completing the expanded search day, police noted that the witness's statement was the first lead related to unusual activity on the night of the disappearance. Though it provided no precise coordinates, the information about the engine noise and arguing was significant enough to be added to the investigation map as a new line of inquiry, opening the possibility that the couple had left the main route via a little-known trail. While the exact origin of the sound remained unidentified, delineating the corresponding area allowed police to open an additional search branch previously unconsidered, thereby expanding the investigation into a region with more complex terrain than the routes examined earlier. On the morning of January 21, 1953, after compiling the witness statement regarding the engine noise and arguing voices on the night of the disappearance, Casselton police dispatched a dedicated search team back to the described area, this time with the sole task of focusing on identifying signs of vehicle movement based on the terrain conditions and wind direction recorded on the night of January 17. This area lay along the strip of land between the Kestrel farm and the Maple Ridge rise, a region with little traffic activity in winter due to its soft road base, heavy snow cover, and lack of maintenance. The search team began at the point the witness identified as the direction from which the sound had carried, then expanded the search in a fan pattern to avoid missing any secondary trails that might lead to the location where the engine noise originated. Strong winds in the preceding days had blown the snow into uneven layers, creating bumpy, difficult-to-observe terrain. However, after more than an hour of sweeping, the team discovered a roughly 7-meter-long section of snow, showing compression from tire pressure. Although the edges of the tracks had been blurred and distorted by wind, police marked the area with wooden stakes and began taking measurements. Using a steel tape, they measured the width of the remaining tire ruts. The distance between the outer edges was nearly 56 inches, while the depth of snow compression at the remaining points ranged from 1.5 to 3 inches. These figures were not sufficient to immediately identify the vehicle type, but the tread pattern and force distribution indicated the ruts belonged to a mid-size passenger car, not an agricultural truck, tractor, or heavy vehicle, which would typically leave deeper and wider impressions. For comparison, police referred to the list of common vehicle models in North Dakota during 1952 to 1953, including the Plymouth Cranbrook, Ford Custom Line, Chevrolet Style Line, and Dodge Coronet. All of these had rear axle widths ranging from 54 to 58 inches, meaning the newly discovered tire tracks were entirely consistent with one of the passenger cars like the one Thomas regularly used to travel between Wheatland and Casselton. Continuing to examine the end of the tire track, the search team noted that the ruts did not head toward Wheatland as Thomas's intended route would have required, but instead veered southeast, an entirely illogical direction for returning home after the dance. This turn meant leaving Highway 10 and heading deep into a sparsely populated area containing only a few scattered farms and trails leading toward the ridges near Maple Ridge. Police assessed that the likelihood of these tire tracks having been made on the night of the disappearance was very high, because the light snowfall on the morning of January 18 was insufficient to completely erase them, while strong winds could blur the edges, resulting in their current appearance. Based on the characteristics of the remaining tracks, the search team followed the ruts as far as possible. However, only about 10 meters farther, the tracks disappeared completely due to intense wind sweeping across the open edge, covering the old ruts with fresh snow. The team attempted to use probes to detect compressed layers beneath, but could not confirm the continuation because the snow was too deep and the underlying ground had frozen solid. Although they could not trace the full path of travel, police still noted the anomaly of the turn. There was no reasonable explanation for Thomas to drive southeast at that time, especially since the area was completely off his usual routes or any place he had reason to visit. This raised questions about whether the change of direction was voluntary or forced into the remote area. To strengthen the findings, the search team surveyed a 200-meter radius around the track segment to check for signs the vehicle may have stopped or become stuck. However, all surrounding areas showed no snow pits, broken branches, or material fragments that could be linked to the Plymouth or the victim's personal belongings. Several other minor compression marks were noted, but measurements of size and depth determined they belonged to farm vehicles moving early on the morning of January 18 and did not match the suspect track pattern. Thus, although the witness-designated area did not provide direct evidence of the victim's presence, it did reveal an unusual tire track that did not align with the route home and matched the size of the type of vehicle Thomas drove. This discovery allowed authorities to conclude that the victims or their vehicle had left Highway 10 in an unexplained direction, heading deep into an area served only by dirt trails directly contrary to the familiar route they should have taken. This provided the basis for police to mark the area on the investigation map as a location requiring expanded examination, while also prompting a re-evaluation of all initial hypotheses concerning the couple's movements on the night of their disappearance. On the morning of January 22, 1953, after compiling all data from the faint tire tracks and the unusual turn documented in the witness-indicated area, Casselton Police, in coordination with the Cass County search team, expanded the sweep southeastward along the trails leading toward Maple River. This area featured open terrain interspersed with wild grass strips along the river and low depressions easily buried by snow, requiring the team to move slowly and continuously mark each checked section. Near mid-morning, while observing from a low rise overlooking the field edge, one search team member spotted a dark object protruding slightly above the white snow, its color matching the roof of Thomas Brandt's Plymouth. Police approached cautiously and confirmed the vehicle was indeed the blue Plymouth described earlier by the family. The car sat at the edge of the field, about 100 meters from the Maple River bank, with its front end angled slightly southwest as though it had stopped after a short distance off the trail. But there were no signs of plunging, getting stuck, or collision. The snow around the vehicle was relatively level, with no deep ruts or plowed marks indicating loss of control. The front of the car showed no dents, the windshield was intact, headlights unbroken, front bumper free of fresh scratches, evidence that the vehicle had not been in an accident. Police further noted that the snow immediately beside the right side tire showed light compression, suggesting the car had been deliberately stopped rather than forced to halt due to mechanical failure. Looking into the cabin through the windows, they observed the steering wheel in normal position, no key in the ignition, driver's seat not violently displaced. All doors were locked, with no signs of forced entry, and the paint surface showed no unusual scratches. The distance from the trail to the car's position was only about 30 meters, making it plausible that the vehicle left the path either by the driver's choice or under compulsion before coming to a stop. However, no on-site evidence yet indicated what happened after the car stopped. Police immediately secured the area, designating the Plymouth location as crime scene number 1 in the disappearance case, and reported to command for additional personnel and equipment to conduct a vehicle examination according to 1953 procedures. Investigation team members measured distances, photographed the scene from multiple angles, and recorded the car's orientation relative to wind conditions on the night of January 17 to determine whether it had been wind-drifted or driver-controlled. The body of the car was completely cold, showing no signs of recent operation. However, this was consistent with a multi-day disappearance timeline. The area surrounding the vehicle was carefully searched for footprints, dropped items, or any physical evidence related to Thomas and Evelyn, but snowfall and strong winds in the preceding days had rendered the entire ground uniform, preserving no exploitable traces. Police opened the vehicle using specialized tools after obtaining permission, noting that the interior was not seriously disturbed. Seats in original position, documents in the glove compartment untouched, no property missing. This ruled out initial robbery as a motive. They also inspected pedals, floor mats, and areas near the bench seat, but no snow had adhered inside, indicating the car had been locked before bad weather set in. External examination of the vehicle yielded no clear signals, no drag marks, blood, torn fabric, or objects indicating a struggle near the car. The team collected surface snow layers around the vehicle in case microscopic particles were present, though 1953 analysis equipment was insufficient for deep processing. Nevertheless, finding the Plymouth in an area far removed from any logical route raised many questions. Why was the car stopped here? Who was driving at the time? What caused the victims to leave the main path? And most importantly, where did they go after the car stopped? Upon closer inspection behind the vehicle, police noted a very faint compressed snow trail extending a few meters eastward, but it was too indistinct to determine whether it was footprints or simply snowmelt and refreeze due to wind conditions. The search day's closing report stated that no physical evidence yet clearly explained why the car was at this location or why the victims disappeared. The vehicle served only as a marker indicating their journey ended here, but provided no answers to the key questions. Police officially designated this as the primary crime scene of the disappearance, while simultaneously determining that crime scene number 1 carried no direct clues about the whereabouts or condition of Thomas and Evelyn, forcing the investigation to shift to subsequent analysis and search steps based on remaining possibilities. The discovery of Thomas Brandt's Plymouth in the field near Maple River marked a critical turning point in the investigation, compelling Casselton police to conduct a comprehensive analysis of crime scene number 1 to determine the most plausible scenario leading to the vehicle's appearance in a location completely unfamiliar to the route back to Wheatland. After compiling all collected data, including the vehicle's position, parked attitude, intact body condition, undisturbed interior, absence of skid or brake marks, lack of collision evidence, and no direct evidence of conflict, police formulated 3 initial theoretical possibilities. First, Thomas and Evelyn left voluntarily. Second, the victims were involved in an accident that left no trace. And third, they were forced off the route and compelled to stop the vehicle at this location. To assess the feasibility of each, investigators began eliminating hypotheses based on scene characteristics and lifestyle habits provided by family, colleagues, and friends. Regarding the first possibility, voluntary departure, police analyzed that if Thomas and Evelyn had intentionally left the area, the car would not have been left fully locked, as people departing voluntarily typically plan further travel and do not abandon a vehicle in the middle of a field in sub-zero weather. Additionally, there was no evidence they had taken personal belongings. Family confirmed neither had any intention of going far, and all important documents remained in the car. Moreover, the illogical southeast turn from the trail did not correspond to any known destination of the two. All these factors made voluntary departure implausible, and it was ruled out. For the second possibility, accident police compared the scene to common winter vehicle accident features: long skid marks, churned snow, deep sink marks on the side of loss of control, brake marks on ice, scattered glass or metal fragments, collapsed snow pits where a vehicle plunged. However, none of these signs appeared around the Plymouth. The car was stopped aligned with the trail direction, showed no mechanical damage, and had no skid marks. Furthermore, if the vehicle had broken down and the victims left to seek help, they would have left footprints, but the entire area around the car showed no traces, partly due to wind and snow, but still inconsistent with behavior of people seeking assistance in harsh weather. This effectively eliminated the accident possibility. With the first 2 hypotheses ruled out, investigators focused entirely on the third coercion. The car stop in a remote location, the illogical turn, and the intact but abandoned vehicle without reasonable explanation were all indicators of external intervention. Additionally, the fact that the car was locked from the outside reinforced the theory that whoever was controlling the vehicle at the time of stopping was not Thomas, or if it was Thomas, he acted under duress. The turn toward a sparsely populated area also fit the behavior of someone wishing to avoid being seen. Police re-examined the witness statement about hearing arguing voices and a revving engine on the night of the incident, concluding the sounds were highly likely related to the vehicle being forced off the main route. Moreover, the faint tire track found earlier on the trail matched the width of common passenger cars of the era, including Thomas's Benny, and led precisely toward the location where the Plymouth was discovered. This created a logical sequence. The vehicle was forced off the main road, traveled along a little-used trail, continued a few hundred meters, then stopped in the field near Maple River. Analysis of the vehicle's condition also showed no signs of struggle inside the cabin or scuffle outside, suggesting that if coercion occurred, it most likely took place before reaching this location, or the coercing party had full control of the situation without needing to use violence that would leave traces. After synthesizing all elements: unusual tire tracks, illogical turn, Intact vehicle, clean scene, witness statement. Vehicle interior condition. Location far from the route home. Police concluded that the coercion hypothesis was the only one consistent with the entire body of evidence. From the afternoon of January 22, investigators officially adopted this as the primary investigative focus, marking the shift from searching for an accident to examining the possibility of third-party intervention in the disappearance of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart. After the coercion hypothesis became the primary investigative direction, Casselton police began reviewing all individuals with direct or indirect connections to Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart, in order to identify anyone who had both motive and opportunity to intervene in the victim's journey on the night of January 17, 1953. In this list, the most prominent name, and the one considered the natural suspect, was Diana Mercer, Thomas's ex-wife. Their divorce had been finalized less than 7 months before the incident, and according to statements from Thomas's family as well as his friends, the post-divorce relationship was far from amicable, as the civil records might suggest. To assess Diana's position in the case, police collected her schedule for the days before and after the victims disappeared. They traveled to Fargo, where Diana lived, and interviewed her neighbors and co-workers at the local sewing workshop. According to the statements, Diana was at work on the morning and afternoon of January 17th, finishing her shift around 5:00. For the evening, some people said she stayed home the entire time, while one other person vaguely recalled that Diana left the house for about an hour after dinner, but did not know where she went. When questioned by police, Diana stated that she stayed home all evening to work on household accounts, a claim that did not fully align with the information gathered from neighbors. When these statements were cross-checked against the time the witness heard the engine noise and arguing voices, police noted there was no evidence confirming Diana was at home during that period, nor did anyone directly witness her presence at her residence late at night. Additionally, given that the distance from Fargo to the Casselton Wheatland area was not overly long, it was entirely possible for her to leave home unnoticed, especially in sparsely populated neighborhoods where neighbors did not habitually monitor each other's nighttime activities. After gathering her schedule, police moved on to verifying Diana's past behavior toward Thomas, since personal motive is always one of the key factors in disappearances showing signs of coercion. Thomas's family reported that Diana had displayed tension and dissatisfaction during the final stages of their marriage, including frequent late-night phone calls, suddenly showing up at Thomas's workplace to pressure him about finances, and occasionally following him when he traveled between Fargo and Wheatland. One of Thomas's friends recounted that in the months leading up to the divorce, Diana had repeatedly complained that Thomas was too eager to leave the old life behind, and she was unhappy when he began seeing Evelyn. Several handwritten letters from Diana to Thomas, provided to police by the family, also contained outbursts expressing anger and disappointment toward him. Although the content did not directly threaten harm to Thomas, these strong emotional expressions were noted as elements requiring consideration. A central question police asked was whether Diana could have been present in the Casselton Wheatland area on the night the victims disappeared. When evaluating travel feasibility, investigators determined that the drive from Fargo to Casselton could be completed in about an hour, or even less at night when roads were empty. If Diana left Fargo around 9:10 p.m., she could have reached the Casselton area close to the time the witness heard the arguing and engine revving. This made her denial of staying home all evening even more suspicious. Another factor police examined was her personality and behavioral history. Although Diana had no criminal record or prior arrests, many acquaintances described her as highly emotional and prone to strong reactions when feeling abandoned or disrespected. After the divorce, she did not hide her resentment toward Thomas, quickly rebuilding his life, especially when he appeared publicly with Evelyn at community events in Casselton. All these elements provided sufficient grounds for police to place Diana in the priority suspect category within the context of the coercion hypothesis being the main investigative focus. However, police still lacked direct evidence linking Diana to the Plymouth crime scene or the area where the faint tire tracks were found. Yet in the overall picture of the investigation, her unclear whereabouts that night, inconsistent statements, and potential motive tied to her personal relationship with Thomas made Diana the first person who needed further monitoring and cross-verification of information. Placing Diana Mercer in the priority suspect group was not based solely on possible motive, but also because she was the only individual within the close circle of the two victims whose whereabouts on the night of January 17 could not be independently verified. A noteworthy coincidence given that Thomas's car was found in an unusual location with no signs of an accident. Immediately after, Diana Mercer was placed in the priority suspect category, but before any direct evidence justified stronger measures, Casselton police returned to the core of scene work, searching for traces of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart in the area surrounding the Plymouth. On January 23, 1953, the search team expanded the sweep radius from the vehicle's position in concentric arcs, first 200 meters, then 500 meters, and finally over 1 kilometer to cover the open field, the edge of sparse woods, and the section of Maple River bank running parallel to the area. This was complex winter terrain, deep snow, strong winds, many riverbank sections covered by thin ice and dry brush, requiring close coordination between foot teams and those using manual probes. The main objective was to detect any signs showing in which direction the victims might have left the vehicle, or to determine whether any evidence related to them was present nearby. Police began by examining the area east of the car, where a slightly depressed strip of land was more likely to retain traces than deeper depressions swept by wind. However, any potential compressions or depressions had been covered by fresh snow, making it nearly impossible to distinguish human footprints from natural phenomena. The search team then moved to the southern edge of the sparse woods, where scattered fir trees created small windbreaks. Here, snow was less wind-scoured, increasing the chance of preserving footprints or dropped objects. Yet after more than 2 hours of checking each tree base and depression, searchers found no evidence such as torn fabric, personal papers, jewelry, or items that could be linked to Thomas and Evelyn. A few snow depressions were noted, but all appeared to be from wildlife and lacked human footprint characteristics. From the wood's edge, the team shifted to the Maple River bank, where terrain was relatively hazardous due to unstable river ice. Without modern equipment, such as sonar or ice-penetrating devices available at the time, the team could only walk along the bank, observing interruptions in the ice surface, looking for cracks or signs of heavy objects falling through. That the river ice remained intact, with no recorded collapses, cracks, or unusual warping. Some low brush sections of the bank were carefully checked, especially where snow had built up in layered drifts, but no signs indicated human movement around the time of the disappearance. On the west side of the vehicle, searchers swept an area thick with dry grass, where snow tended to cling and form thicker patches than on open ground. This was considered a potential spot for footprints or dropped evidence during movement. Nonetheless, all findings were only wind-disturbed snow and uneven melt-freeze patterns. To ensure nothing was missed, police repeated the search vertically, following the entire path leading to Maple River, checking every small rise, clump of trees, and wind-blown snowbanks. They also used manual drag hooks to probe deep snow-covered areas, but found only rocks, broken branches, and thin ice layers underneath, nothing related to the disappearance. By late afternoon, the team intensified the search north of the vehicle, where a wide, flat clearing with little tree cover might retain traces due to natural snow compression. However, the area was completely empty. The snow surface was smooth and showed no compressions indicating anyone had passed through after the night of January 17. From the results obtained, the search team reconvened at crime scene number 1 and concluded that there were no bodies, no large items of evidence, such as clothing fragments, purses, wallets, identification papers, and no physical signs of struggle or dragging. The lack of any detectable traces led police to conclude that if Thomas and Evelyn had left the vehicle, they did not leave marks clear enough to survive 2 nights of strong wind and fresh snow. From a scene analysis perspective, this opened 2 possibilities. Either the victims left the vehicle in a way that avoided leaving easily recognizable traces, or they never left the area for some as-yet undetermined reason. At the end of the first expanded search day, police officially recorded the 1-kilometer radius around the vehicle provided no physical clues about the victim's presence or direction of movement. The wooded area and Maple River bank yielded no direct evidence related to their whereabouts, and no major items of evidence were found across the entire zone. Although the collected data were not groundbreaking, they played an important role. They confirmed that crime scene number 1 was not the site of overt violent activity and ruled out the possibility that bodies had been left nearby. This forced investigators to continue evaluating other feasible directions based on the remaining indirect indicators. Although the expanded search around crime scene number 1 produced no major discoveries of bodies or direct clues about Thomas and Evelyn's direction of movement, the investigative team continued meticulously checking every small sub-area within the marked zone, aiming to collect any scattered items that might serve as clues in later analysis phases. On the morning of January 24, 1953, while re-examining the southern wood's edge, one search team member found a small dark piece of fabric caught under dry grass protruding above the snow surface. The fabric fragment was only the size of 2 fingertips, frayed at the edges, and appeared to have been exposed to weather for several days, but lacked any features sufficient to determine whether it came from men's or women's clothing. When the area around this spot was further checked, police found no additional fabric pieces, making its origin difficult to establish. However, because the location fell within the search perimeter tied to the disappearance, the fragment was sealed according to 1953 evidence procedures and its exact position noted for the record. Also that morning, the team re-examined the western riverbank area, where snow was deeply compressed but had shown no clear traces in previous days. There, a faint footprint was discovered at the edge of a gently sloping strip of ground. The print was not intact, only the toe area, and part of one side remained visible, and snow cover had erased the entire sole pattern. The spacing between this print and nearby snow depressions did not form a sequence sufficient to determine direction of travel or number of people. When measured, the print was about 3.5 inches wide, with the remaining length only about 5 inches due to damage to the heel portion. Based on these measurements, police could only conclude it was an adult's footprint, but could not determine gender, shoe size, or time of impression. Because it could not be established whether the print was recent or pre-existing, the evidence was recorded as reference only and held no conclusive value at this stage. By afternoon, while sweeping the wild grass area near the northern rise where wind often swirled and exposed light, Object 1 search team member found a torn scrap of paper half buried under snow. The paper fragment was small, palm-sized, with writing almost completely blurred by moisture. A few remaining ink strokes were visible but too faint to read. There was no identifying information, no signature, no numbers, no useful traces. The paper sample was sealed to prevent further damage, but police noted that with 1953 analysis technology, they could not recover the writing or scientifically determine the paper's origin. The 3 items of evidence: a fabric fragment, a faint footprint, and a torn paper scrap, although not providing a breakthrough, were entered into the disappearance case evidence log, particularly because the entire area around the Plymouth had yielded almost nothing else. Collecting such small, scattered items reflected investigative methods under the technical limitations of the era. Any object not clearly part of the natural environment could potentially become a clue in the future if analysis technology advanced, or if new evidence emerged for comparison. Police also followed proper storage protocol, placing each item in a separately sealed, wax-sealed envelope, clearly marked with date, time, collector's name, weather conditions, and discovery location. In the day's final notes, investigators emphasized that these items could not yet prove the presence or movement direction of Thomas and Evelyn, but because they were found within the vicinity of crime scene number 1, they needed to be carefully preserved in case later information or evidence could connect them. The fabric fragment received particular attention because its color and material might allow identification if either victim had worn similar clothing on the night of disappearance in detail, not yet fully confirmed by family. The faint footprint and torn paper scrap were classified as low reliability evidence but could become significant if additional matching data surfaced in the future. At the close of operations on January 24, the official investigation log recorded the expanded area around crime scene number 1 yielded no large evidence or signs of bodies, but 3 small items were collected as reference material. Due to the technical limitations of 1953, they could not be deeply analyzed, but they were archived in the file as potential pieces for a later investigative phase when conditions permitted. In the context of crime scene number 1 providing no clear leads, and the small collected items still unanalyzable with 1953 technology, investigators were forced to return to evaluating foundational elements that could explain why Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart disappeared, with a focus on personal conflicts that might have served as motive. Among those closely connected to Thomas, Diana Mercer, his ex-wife, was the only one with a prolonged history of discord and initially inconsistent statements, making it necessary for police to clearly establish the level of tension between them before the incident. On January 25, 1953, investigators verified statements from people who knew both parties during the period before and after the divorce. In Wheatland, several of Thomas's friends described the final months of 1951 and early 1952 as a time of constant tension, with Diana frequently appearing at Thomas's workplace or temporary lodging to question or argue. mainly over financial issues, irregular work hours, and suspicions that Thomas was involved with someone else. One of Thomas's co-workers clearly recalled an incident a few months before the divorce when Diana drove to the railroad yard and demanded to see him during work hours, creating a situation that required his supervisor's intervention. Another person stated they had heard Diana say she would make him answer for it if Thomas continued pursuing the end of the marriage. These descriptions were regarded as evidence of long-standing instability in their relationship. When gathering information from people who knew Evelyn and Casselton, police received comments suggesting Diana may have known about Thomas and Evelyn's relationship before the divorce was finalized. One teacher at the school where Evelyn worked said she had seen Diana appear at the teacher's boarding house around the time Evelyn first moved in. Although there was no direct interaction, her presence was considered unusual since Diana had no work or personal reason to be there. Another friend shared that Evelyn had once expressed concern about Diana trying to control Thomas even after they had begun dividing property and preparing to complete the divorce. These accounts help police understand that the level of conflict may have gone beyond ordinary civil disputes. In addition to statements, police collected letters and notes still kept by Thomas's family. Among them were several handwritten notes from Diana to Thomas in the 6 months before the divorce, some mentioning that he had to take responsibility for the family's situation and could not simply cut everything off like that. The language was not overtly threatening but expressed strong dissatisfaction and a need for control. Another undated letter, which the family placed in late 1952, referred to Diana's inability to bear him disappearing from her life as if no one was affected. Overall, the content was insufficient to constitute incriminating evidence, but it showed Diana had a high level of emotional attachment and difficulty accepting the end of the marriage. When cross-referencing this data with statements about her whereabouts on the night of January 17th, police noted clear inconsistencies. Diana said she stayed home all evening, but 2 neighbors confirmed they did not see her from after 8:00 p.m. until around midnight. No one could confirm where she was during the window that overlapped with the witness hearing arguing voices and an engine revving on the trail. This comparison led investigators to assess that Diana's statement lacked sufficient reliability. Based on potential motive, the tense divorce circumstances, her discomfort with Thomas's relationship with Evelyn, the emotional reactivity described by many acquaintances, and her inability to prove her location during the critical time frame, police continued analyzing whether Diana could have traveled from Fargo to the Casselton wheatland area on the night of the incident. Estimates showed the distance could be covered in about an hour by personal vehicle, and her leaving home unnoticed was entirely plausible. All these factors reinforced the hypothesis that if someone coerced the victims off their route, Diana had both motive and opportunity to do so. Although there was still no direct evidence connecting her to the Plymouth or the location of the faint tire tracks, based on the overall analysis of personal conflict and prior behavior, Diana remained at the top of the suspect list. In the end-of-day report on January 25th, police clearly stated that background investigation showed Diana not only had strong motive but also the capability to be in the area at the time of the disappearance, and her inconsistent statements prevented investigators from ruling out her involvement in the case. While Diana Mercer remained at the top of the suspect list based on the background of personal conflict and inconsistencies in her statements, investigators still had to carry out an important screening step to rule out the possibility that the disappearance involved strangers to the victims, such as long-haul truck drivers, overnight travelers, or individuals passing through the Casselton wheatland area at the time of the incident. This was a mandatory procedure in disappearances showing signs of coercion to ensure no potential suspects outside the victim's personal circle were overlooked. On January 26, 1953, Casselton police reviewed the list of vehicles that passed through the gas station on the western edge of Casselton, the last stop on the route Thomas usually took. The station owner stated that on the evening of January 17, only 3 vehicles refueled: a produce truck from Tower City heading to Fargo, a 2-door Ford driven by a young man, and a delivery truck belonging to a nearby shipping company. Police quickly verified each case. The produce truck driver, a local farmer, said he left Tower City around 9:00 p.m., refueled in Casselton, continued to Fargo, and stayed overnight at his sister's house. His travel time did not overlap with the incident window, and he confirmed he did not head toward Wheatland. The driver of the 2-door Ford was identified as a college student, driving from Fargo to visit family in Enderlin. He stated he refueled around 9:45 p.m., left Casselton shortly afterward, and drove straight along Highway 10 without turning onto any side roads. Follow-up checks found no indication he was in the Maple River area on the night of January 17. The third vehicle was a delivery truck for a garment transport company. The driver confirmed he completed his final delivery in Fargo and returned to Casselton before 10,000 pour his, then left the company around midnight to head home east of town. His route did not pass through the Wheatland area and did not cross the location where the faint tire tracks were recorded. At the late-night diner near Casselton, police interviewed additional customers present on the night of January 17. The list included 4 long-haul drivers and 2 local travelers. All 4 drivers provided consistent schedules. 1 was driving a refrigerated truck to Bismarck, 2 were resting at the diner from 10:10 p.m. until midnight, and the last left late and headed toward Fargo. None of them traveled the route toward Wheatland or deviated from Highway 10 as described by the witness. The local travelers also stated they saw no vehicles turning off the main route between 10 p.m. and midnight. Police continued by checking the only motel near Casselton, where overnight travelers sometimes stayed. The guest register showed 2 people checked in on the evening of January 17, a businessman from Grand Forks and a middle-aged woman from Jamestown, both of whom had verifiable proof they did not leave the motel between 10 and 2 quote, and the next morning. Neither drove during the night nor passed through the Maple River area. In parallel, police reviewed patrol reports from the night of January 17. No patrolling officers recorded any unusual vehicle movement, no vehicles were stopped, and no reports mentioned strange engine noises or vehicles traveling at high speed near the trails. After compiling all sources of information, police concluded that no truck drivers, travelers, or unfamiliar vehicles matched the time and location related to the disappearance. Although some traces, such as the faint tire tracks and the engine noise heard that night, could have multiple explanations, no evidence indicated intervention by strangers in Thomas and Evelyn's journey. This strengthened the assessment that the case most likely stemmed from a personal motive rather than random crime or external parties. This conclusion forced investigators to return to the circle of people known to the victims, narrowing the scope of analysis to individuals with clear motives, including relatives, friends, co-workers, and especially Diana Mercer, who had a history of conflict and unproven whereabouts on the night of the disappearance. After ruling out involvement by outsiders and narrowing suspicion back to people known to the victims, Casselton police continued to face the reality that no specific traces had yet been found showing in what condition Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart left the Plymouth. Since the area where the vehicle was discovered lay near vast agricultural land interspersed with structures abandoned since the 1930s, investigators decided to launch a second expanded search focused on locations that, based on experience at the time, were commonly used for disposal: abandoned wells, animal burial pits, and marshy areas along Maple River with complex terrain and easy concealment. On January 27, 1953, the search team was divided into 3 groups, each assigned a type of terrain. The first group swept abandoned wells scattered within a 2-kilometer radius of the Plymouth's location. Many wells dated from before World War II, their openings overgrown with grass or partially buried by snow, requiring rope ladders to lower personnel to inspect the bottoms. Some wells were completely dry, with only hard-packed earth or rubble at the bottom. Others held standing water, but not deep enough to conceal large objects. The team used high-powered flashlights, iron hooks, and drag lines to thoroughly check each well, but found no traces related to the 2 victims, nor any foreign objects such as clothing, shoes, jewelry, or documents. The second group was tasked with inspecting animal burial pits, scattered across farms along the edge of Maple Ridge. These pits were typically covered with temporary soil or showed signs of periodic disturbance, making it very difficult to distinguish new from old. The team used shovels, picks, and hand pumps to dig into suspected areas. Some pits contained broken animal bones consistent with livestock burial. Others were simply collapsed soil due to weather. None contained human-related evidence. Notably, at one large pit west of Maple River, the team found unusually compacted soil. But upon digging, they uncovered only old agricultural debris, including rotten burlap sacks and decayed wood, no signs of human remains. The third group focused on the marshy riverbank areas, where snow could cover the surface, but underneath lay soft mud or standing water. This terrain was hazardous due to the risk of sinking, so the team used long probes, wooden planks for balance, and hand pumps to drain standing water. They swept along the marsh edges, checking every location capable of holding large concealed objects. However, Suspected spots were determined to be only accumulated mud or compressed layers of decayed leaves. Some partially buried logs under ice required deep digging to inspect, but ultimately, nothing related to the victims was found. During the search, investigators also checked large bushes capable of retaining dropped items, but discovered only natural objects, such as broken branches and long accumulated leaves. After 2 consecutive days of work, the teams reconvened to compare results. All agreed that none of the abandoned wells, animal burial pits, or marsh areas showed signs of human remains or any clear evidence. The final consolidated report emphasized one key detail. Although the area was searched very thoroughly, all traces were consistent with agricultural activity or natural processes and lacked characteristics of disposal behavior. This forced investigators to reconsider the possibility that the victims were not harmed near the Maple River area, or that if violence occurred, it left no traces clear enough to survive multiple days of cold weather and strong winds. The final conclusion of the second expanded search stated that throughout the entire area related to crime scene number 1, no bodies were found, no large evidence was discovered, and no direct signs emerged indicating this was the site of criminal activity. This continued to heighten the mystery of the disappearance, forcing police to evaluate remaining investigative directions based on indirect facts and the behavior of related individuals. By early spring 1954, after more than a year of expanded searches, checks of main and secondary roads, abandoned wells, animal burial pits, Maple River marshes, witness interviews, statement cross-checks, collection of small evidence, and elimination of all outside suspects, Casselton investigators were forced to confront the reality that their entire effort had produced no meaningful progress in determining the fate of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart. Internal investigation reports compiled in a closed meeting in March 1954 showed that every approach had been exhausted to the limits of feasibility at the time. Highway 10 showed no accident signs. Farm dirt roads revealed no drag marks or moved objects. The Maple Grove wooded area and Maple River bank had no signs of struggle or discarded items. The victim's Plymouth at crime scene number 1 showed no forced entry, no blood, no signs of struggle. The sole witness provided only disjointed sounds of a vehicle and arguing voices without seeing anyone. Small collected evidence was insufficient to identify individuals or reconstruct events, and the natural suspect, Diana Mercer, while having motive and a history of conflict, lacked physical evidence. No eyewitness saw her on the Casselton-Wheatland route on the night of the disappearance, and no technology of the era allowed more complex trace examination. All analyses indicated that the 1953 to 1954 investigation was severely limited by technological conditions: no DNA testing, no micro-trace analysis techniques, no footwear tire databases, no ability to retrieve communication or travel records. The outdoor scene was quickly erased of critical signs by snow, wind, and natural changes within the first 48 hours. This prevented police from reaching any definitive investigative conclusion about the victim's final movements or proving coercion, while completely ruling out voluntary departure. In 1954, the Cass County Chief Investigator issued a final report stating that local resources had been used to the maximum, but the case lacked basic evidentiary foundation to continue. The report stated, no bodies, no identified crime scene, no eyewitness to violent acts, and no direct evidence tied to any suspect. The level of uncertainty exceeds current investigative capability. After review, the Cass County Sheriff's Office officially decided to classify the disappearance of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart as a cold case. All investigative materials, from route maps, scene photographs, interview transcripts, small evidence packaged in paper bags, tire track analysis reports, to individual officers' statements, were numbered and archived under Missing Persons Unresolved 1953. The case closure date was recorded in the archive log in April 1954. This did not mean the case was forgotten, but it was an acknowledgement that further investigative possibilities could not be pursued until new evidence or new technology emerged. For the small communities of Casselton and Wheatland, this decision closed a year of fragile hope and marked the shift of the case from an urgent search to an unsolved mystery, quietly resting in the Cass County file cabinets, awaiting another opportunity to be reopened. 4 decades after the disappearance file of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart was closed, the Cass County Archive still preserved in original condition the evidence collected during the winter of 1953 to 1954, including the small fabric fragment, torn paper scrap, faint footprint traced on carbon paper, along with wooden ruler and chalk measurements of the tire track. In 2000, when the state of North Dakota launched a program to review historical missing persons cases to test new forensic technology, the Brant Hart victims file was selected as one of the pilot cases, partly due to its long-standing mystery and partly because the evidence remained in relatively intact condition. On March 12, 2000, all evidence was transferred to the State Forensic Laboratory in Bismarck for re-examination. The first technique applied was fiber spectroscopy analysis, using a modern FTIR system capable of identifying polymer characteristics and weave patterns with far greater accuracy than the 1953 microscopic methods. The small fabric fragment found near the Maple River bank, previously noted only as fabric fragment unknown source, was placed under the instrument. Results showed the fibers were a rayon cotton blend woven in a sateen structure with a faded pale blue dye group. When cross-referenced with archived records of Evelyn Hart's clothing, investigators discovered she owned a thin pastel blue coat purchased in Fargo in 1952, made from the exact fabric blend and weave type as the tested sample. Dye characteristics and fiber wear also suggested the fragment was torn from the coat's edge by strong pulling force. The laboratory confirmed a high degree of correspondence sufficient to consider the fragment as belonging to Evelyn, thereby providing the first direct physical link between a victim and the riverbank area, where earlier search teams had found no major traces. Next, the tire track records were digitized. In 1953, police could only manually measure rut widths and note track partially erased by wind, yielding very limited results. But in 2000, geometric simulation technology allowed reconstruction of a 3D model of the tire track from raw parameters by recreating rut depth, angle, trajectory, and turning radius. Data entered into the software showed the track width matched a 1949 to 1951 Mercury 8 sedan, a model recorded in Diana Mercer's declaration as one she used during the final period of her marriage to Thomas Brant. The tread configuration match reached a level that could not be considered coincidental, especially since the track's turning direction aligned with the direction the witness had described, leaving the side road and heading deeper into agricultural land, completely contrary to the victim's route home. Investigators immediately re-examined all small evidence previously deemed insufficient legal value in 1953. The torn paper scrap was illuminated under multi-wavelength light, revealing very faint pencil marks that appeared to be the end of a number 7 or 1, not fully legible but consistent with Diana's handwriting style in post-divorce letters. The faint footprint, only briefly described in old reports. After digital analysis showed a rounded heel shape and simple rubber tread pattern matching women's Southern Mills shoes commonly sold in Fargo in 1953 and purchased by Diana herself at that time. According to surviving receipts, when these pieces of evidence were rearranged by time and space sequence, a logical chain began to emerge. Evelyn's fabric fragment near the riverbank, tire tracks leading precisely to that area and matching a car Diana once used, footprint matching the type she wore, tire, torn, paper scrap consistent with her handwriting. Each individual detail remained insufficient for a conclusive finding, but when connected, they formed a reasonable structure that the 1953 investigation could not recognize due to technological limitations. The re-examination report concluded that the small evidence, when analyzed with 2000 technology, was no longer meaningless, scattered fragments, but became a mutually reinforcing data system, opening the possibility of determining the victim's final path and the potential role of a specific suspect. This laid the direct groundwork for the Brant Hart cold case to have its first opportunity for reopening after nearly half a century. At the end of April 2000, as the re-examination results gave the Brant Hart file its first basis for potential reopening, Cass County Police received a call from Sanford Hospital in Fargo regarding a terminally ill elderly patient who claimed he knew something the police in 1953 missed. The man Lester Holcomb, 84 years old, had once lived on a farm about 3 miles southwest of crime scene number 1, and according to hospital records, he requested to speak with an investigator before losing consciousness. When 2 investigators arrived, Holcomb was breathing weakly, his voice halting, but he insisted he was still lucid enough to recount what he had kept in his heart for too long. He stated that on the night Thomas Brant and Evelyn Hart disappeared, while sleeping in his old wooden house next to the side road leading to Maple Ridge, he heard the familiar engine sound of a Mercury 8 moving slowly on the dirt road, an engine growling low like it was choked. characteristic of that old model in winter. What caught his attention was not the engine, but the headlights sweeping across his window near midnight. An unusual occurrence, because that side road was almost unused at that time of year except by a few farmers or out-of-season hunters. Holcomb recounted stepping out under the porch and watching the lights fade. In the dim light, he saw the vehicle pause for about 15 seconds at a small turn leading into a wasteland behind a row of burned maple trees from years earlier. Holcomb emphasized that the car did not continue straight but turned onto a trail and narrow path that the 1953 police had never marked or included in search maps. When asked how he remembered the figure in the vehicle, Holcomb struggled to sit up and stated firmly, before the car turned off its lights, he saw the silhouette of a woman with short, curled hair in the driver's seat, leaning forward as if checking something below the steering wheel. He could not see her face clearly, but recognized the distinctive side profile of the hairstyle Diana Mercer had worn during the final years of her marriage to Thomas A. Detail coincidentally matching descriptions in archival photos. This drew particular attention from the two investigators, as until then, no witness had provided a direct description of a woman appearing near the side road where the tire tracks were found. When asked why he had not reported it to police in 1953, Holcomb replied that at the time he simply thought someone was lost, and he himself was reluctant to be seen as stirring up trouble in a small farming community that generally avoided involvement with authorities. As he grew older, he increasingly felt he had unintentionally withheld something potentially important, and now his failing health made him want to leave a final word. The investigators immediately asked him to describe the exact location where the car turned. Though his breathing was weak, Holcomb shakily drew on a sheet of paper on the table, a side road running parallel to the maple tree row, turning left into the wasteland where an old livestock barn had stood before being abandoned after the 1948 storm. He stressed that the turn was about 200 yards south of windmarker number 14, a position completely unmarked on the 1953 search maps because the team considered the trail long abandoned. The two investigators immediately compared Holcomb's sketch with the 2000 digitized maps. The result showed the trail Holcomb described did exist on agricultural land maps from the 1940s to 1950s, but was no longer marked by 1953 because the area was regarded as fallow land. This explained why the initial search teams had not swept that area. It was not within the scope of logical travel routes and was not listed in official paths. The investigators continued asking whether Holcomb saw anyone leave the vehicle or heard unusual sounds. He shook his head, saying that after the car turned off its lights, he returned inside because it was too cold. But a few minutes later, he heard a sound like a car door slamming hard, followed by prolonged silence. He heard no screams or sounds of struggle, but he distinctly remembered the sound was not natural in the quiet rural winter night. At the end of the conversation, Holcomb's condition deteriorated rapidly. He only managed one final sentence. He believed that car did not go into the wasteland just to turn around. As he slipped into a coma, the investigators exchanged glances, understanding that the statement, though decades late, opened an entirely new coordinate, never recorded in the entire 1953 investigation. Back at headquarters, they immediately digitized Holcomb's drawing and entered it into the county GIS system to cross-reference with the tire track simulation results from the re-examination. Notably, the turn direction Holcomb described aligned significantly with the trajectory simulated from the 1953 tire tracks. Adding substantial weight to the new witness's account, the investigation map was updated, marking the wasteland behind the maple row as a priority area for supplemental survey, the first new point of sufficient value in decades to consider deploying a field search. With this unexpected piece from a dying witness, a case long thought permanently buried in the past suddenly gained a new avenue of pursuit that had never been opened before. After Lester Holcomb's dying statement was recorded and the sketch of the Mercury ape turning onto the old trail was digitized, the investigative team immediately proceeded with terrain verification by overlaying the 1953 agricultural land maps with the 2000 digital mapping system to understand why that area had never been included in the initial search perimeter. When the two map layers were superimposed, a significant discrepancy emerged. The 1953 map labeled the entire strip of land behind the row of maple trees, where Holcomb described the car turning as Maple Ridge High Ground, a highland area extending along the natural slope edge. But by 2000, this zone had been reclassified as private land, with boundaries clearly redrawn according to land use changes that occurred in the late 1960s. This fact led investigators to realize that the 1953 search team may have overlooked the high ground for two reasons. First, it lay outside the area marked as public access, and second, the landowner, at the time a reclusive farming family with minimal contact with neighbors, did not cooperate with the search, preventing police from penetrating deep into private property as they can today. This explained why all 1953 documents concluded the area west of Maple River was not suspicious, even though topographic maps clearly showed a long highland strip immediately adjacent to previously checked locations capable of effectively concealing traces. The investigative team decided to survey the area using elevation measurement equipment and modern satellite imagery. When analyzing low-altitude photographs of the zone, they observed a clear difference in ground structure. Most of Maple Ridge High Ground had stable wild grass cover, but a narrow strip about 30 yards wide showed a slight bulge, discolored soil, and uneven compaction, as though it had undergone digging and filling many years earlier. This discovery became even more significant when the team cross-referenced the trail Holcomb described. The turnoff leading into the high ground ran precisely adjacent to that anomalous, bulging strip. One officer responsible for terrain analysis backtracked Casselton area climate data from the 1950s and confirmed that under the 1953 winter conditions, any soil disturbance would have been quickly covered by snow and blurred by wind within days, making it difficult for the original search team to notice anything unusual without knowing the exact spot to examine. But with 2000 imagery, the long-term soil structure, particularly differences in pH and grass growth patterns, clearly indicated mechanical intervention in the past. Part of the surface showed darker coloration, resembling imported fill soil, a common feature when backfilling a deep pit. Investigators continued by reviewing land use records and discovered that Maple Ridge High Ground had belonged to the Dunn family from 1939 to 1978. The Dunns were documented as living in isolation, rarely interacting with neighbors, and known for refusing outsiders access to their property, especially the area behind the Maple Road, the exact location Holcomb described. Archived 1953 documents confirm that police had requested access to the land, but lacked a search warrant because the case was then regarded only as a disappearance without signs of violence. So, the search team respected private property rights and did not enter that zone. This inadvertently left the entire large highland strip completely unexamined, even though it lay right beside the tire track trajectory that 2000 analysis indicated could be linked to the vehicle Diana once used. During the first field survey, the investigative team noted one additional factor that drew their attention: the clear distinction between naturally compacted soil over time and the area of anomalous compaction. A geologist accompanying the team visually determined that in the suspected zone, the soil structure had been disrupted and then recompacted, differing from untouched surrounding areas. Grass in that zone grew thinner and shorter, a characteristic indicating the subsurface soil had been heavily disturbed before vegetation regrew. While continuing documentation, the team realized the trail leading into the high ground had not completely vanished, as 1953 assumptions suggested. Beneath the new grass layer, parallel shallow depressions were still visible remnants of a path once used by vehicles. Although nearly half a century had blurred the traces, their presence, combined with Holcomb's statement and the tire track simulation data, increased the likelihood that this area was directly connected to Thomas and Evelyn's final journey. The investigative team immediately marked Maple Ridge High Ground on the 2000 map with Level 1 priority status, established survey boundaries, and divided it into 3 subzones based on elevation and soil structure in preparation for detailed inspection. The report submitted to the Cass County Investigation Division concluded that the 1953 search perimeter error stemming from reliance on outdated maps and private land boundaries had caused a potentially critical evidence-bearing area to be completely overlooked. The discovery of ancient soil disturbance, the old trail, and the turnoff matching the dying witness's account indicated that Maple Ridge High Ground could play a pivotal role in understanding what happened on the night the victims disappeared. The atmosphere in the police headquarters meeting room grew heavy after nearly half a century. A forgotten highland strip had emerged as the center of a new investigative direction, opening the possibility that mysteries buried in the cold case file for 47 years could be touched for the first time. After Maple Ridge High Ground was identified as the new focal area of the investigation, the interagency task force continued scrutinizing links related to the only suspect in the file with a clear motive, Diana Mercer. The new data from evidence re-examination, the fabric fragment linked to Evelyn, tire tracks matching the Mercury 8 Diana once drove, and the footprint consistent with shoes she commonly wore, were sufficient to obtain an expanded search warrant under 2000 regulations for cold cases with newly surfaced leads. On April 29, 2000, the Cass County judge approved a comprehensive search warrant for the remaining Mercer family storage barn on the outskirts of Wheatland, an old wooden structure built in the late 1940s that Diana had used to store belongings after her divorce from Thomas. In the 1953 inventory report, police had verified the barn at the time of the disappearance, but did not conduct a deep search because no warrant existed and no suspicious signs were apparent. However, that occurred before any evidence tied Diana to the outline route or to Evelyn's personal property. This time, with full legal grounds and new information, a specialized team was dispatched to perform the search to modern standards while still respecting historical evidence preservation limits. Upon arrival, the Mercer barn was locked, its doors weathered, hinges rusted, but the padlock appeared relatively new, indicating that although the structure was old, someone may have entered in recent years. At the same time, land records showed ownership of the barn remained in Diana's name until 1992, when she moved out of state but did not sell or transfer the property. She only leased the surrounding farmland, leaving the barn vacant. This was a critical detail because it confirmed that only Diana or someone she authorized had legal access to the area for nearly 50 years. When the team forced the lock and opened the doors, thick dust covered the wooden floor, but the interior was not as completely abandoned as initially expected. Several wooden crates were neatly stacked in rows in the left corner, their lids bearing old, faded, handwritten tape labels. Winter clothes, old papers, misc. Several other unlabeled crates stood separately toward the back of the barn, drawing the team's attention because this isolated arrangement did not match typical storage patterns. Beginning with the unlabeled crates, they opened them one by one. Many contained miscellaneous items, old picture frames, newspaper clippings, various household goods, but in the sixth crate, they discovered a small pale blue fabric pouch, carefully wrapped in 1954 newspaper. Inside the pouch were 3 pieces of women's jewelry, a silver necklace, a single pearl earring, and a maple leaf-shaped silver hair clip, all individually wrapped in handkerchiefs. Investigators immediately recognized the maple leaf clip due to its distinctive shape. The 1953 disappearance file for Evelyn noted that she frequently wore a silver maple leaf clip on her coat when attending community events. Inside the fabric pouch was also a small tag from a Fargo jewelry store. The ink faded, but still legible with the first 2 letters of the name, E. This prompted the investigative team to immediately secure the entire barn and request additional forensic personnel. When the forensic team arrived, they photographed, sealed, and collected the 3 jewelry items according to procedure. At this stage, origin verification was conducted the same day, based on surviving records from Evelyn's family and photographs of her at the 1952 Christmas party. Results showed the maple leaf clip matched 100% with an item owned by Evelyn. The silver necklace matched the description her sister gave police in 1953 when listing items Evelyn commonly wore. The pearl earring had no specific file description, but fit the style of the jewelry set Evelyn typically used for dances. Most importantly, family confirmed Evelyn always wore the silver necklace on the evening she attended her final dance before disappearing. When asked whether Evelyn had ever stored any of her belongings in the Mercer barn, relatives stated it was completely impossible. The 2 families had no relationship, and Evelyn leaving jewelry in Diana's barn made no sense. Subsequent legal analysis focused on the question, over nearly half a century since Evelyn's disappearance, who had access to the Mercer barn. Property records show Diana was the sole key holder and authorized entrant. Although she left North Dakota in the early 1960s, her failure to sell the property meant no one else had legal right to use the barn without her permission. Investigators also reviewed surrounding farmland lease agreements and confirmed that lessees were permitted access only to cultivated fields, with no right to enter or use the barn interior. The discovery of the victim's jewelry inside a locked property for decades that only Diana could access dramatically elevated suspicion against her. This was the first time since 1953 that direct, physical evidence appeared that could not be reasonably explained as coincidental. Unlike time-eroded traces, the 3 jewelry pieces were clearly personal items, deliberately stored in an unlabeled crate separate from other belongings and carefully wrapped, indicating intentional concealment. A behavioral analysis expert was consulted for preliminary assessment and concluded the way each piece was wrapped in small handkerchiefs placed in a fabric pouch and covered with 1954 newspaper suggested these were not items accidentally retained, but objects of emotional or direct event-related significance that the holder wished to hide. The use of 1954 newspaper also suggested the concealment likely occurred within 1 to 2 years after the disappearance, precisely when Diana was still living in North Dakota. The search continued to expand to shelving at the back of the barn. There, the team found a small tin box containing shopping receipts and notes, mostly belonging to Diana between 1950 and 1954. Although not decisive evidence, this discovery further confirmed that Diana had used the barn as a private storage space, reinforcing the likelihood that the jewelry's presence there was intentional rather than accidental. The search report concluded that the Mercer barn contained personal items belonging to victim Evelyn Hart, a conclusion unprecedented in the case history. This represented the biggest breakthrough since the disappearance nearly half a century earlier. For the first time, evidence directly connected a suspect and a victim within the same enclosed space. The discovery not only shifted the investigative focus, but also forced the task force to rebuild the entire hypothesis regarding the victim's final journey and Diana's role on the night they vanished. Within hours, the level of suspicion against Diana jumped from suspect with motive to suspect directly linked to the victim's personal property, a leap that brought the case to a point of no return. After Evelyn Hart's jewelry was found in the Mercer barn, physical evidence that could not be explained innocently in any direction, the investigative team shifted focus to the only vehicle Diana Mercer is known to have owned and used during 1952-1954, a light gray Studebaker 2R pickup truck, a popular light-duty farm pickup in North Dakota at the time. In the 1953 file, police noted only that Diana had owned the truck but did not search it because she claimed to have sold it about 3 months before Thomas and Evelyn disappeared, and the buyer was reportedly a farmer in the Air area. No deeper investigation occurred because the case was not yet treated as a crime at that time. However, with new evidence, the task force requested retrieval of the Studebaker, tracing it through vehicle registration records, bills of sale, and title transfers. After 4 weeks of following successive owners, they located the truck in a barn on a farm in Montana, where it had been used as a utility vehicle and then abandoned since the 1970s. The Studebaker was rusted, tires flat, interior rotted, but the frame remained relatively intact, an important factor for collecting forensic archaeological samples. The investigative team approached the vehicle with maximum caution. Any remaining soil particles, fibers, or traces in the vehicle compartments could be remnants from 1953. They began by removing the rubber floor mats in the cab and rear cargo area. Beneath the mats was a layer of long compacted dust and soil mixed with decayed fibers and small organic fragments. All were vacuumed with specialized sample collection equipment and sealed to cold case standards. Several soil samples were taken from corner crevices of the cargo bed, where rainwater rarely reached, as these locations often preserve soil composition for decades. The Bismarck laboratory classified the soil into 3 groups: fine dust soil from the cab, dry, crumbly soil from the bed, and compacted soil near the mud flaps. To determine soil origin, they used polarized light microscopy combined with X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, a modern technique completely unavailable to 1953 police. Analysis results showed that samples from the truck bed contained high levels of plagioclase feldspar, a mineral characteristic of the Maple Ridge highland soil formed on ancient glacial till, distinctly different from the common clay agricultural soil in the Wheatland area. When compared with soil samples the investigative team collected from Maple Ridge high ground the previous week, the composition showed near-perfect correspondence in mineral ratios and weathering signatures. This led analysts to conclude that the Studebaker had been present at Maple Ridge, the area suspected of ancient soil disturbance. This match was especially significant because Diana was the only person in 1953 known to have driven the vehicle. The soil analysis was only the beginning. When the laboratory moved to examine fiber samples recovered from seat crevices and door padding, the results were even more striking. Using Raman spectroscopy and scanning electron microscopy fiber analysis, they identified 2 main fiber types: lightly degraded cotton rayon blend and wool nylon blend, typical of women's clothing from the early 1950s. Analysts compared them to the fabric fragment we covered from the Maple River bank and to descriptions of Evelyn's coat, the pastel blue rayon cotton blend coat that had been partially torn. In every attribute, fiber twist, size, fading degree, degradation characteristics, the fibers in the Studebaker matched the edge fragments of Evelyn's coat. differing only slightly in aging due to different preservation conditions. This led the laboratory to a preliminary conclusion. Fibers from Evelyn very likely had once been present in the interior of Diana's vehicle. Another discovery emerged when technicians examined fiber samples under UV light. A thin, dark blue fiber fragment appeared in a seat cushion crevice, matching the color of the inner lining of Evelyn's coat, as seen in 1952 photographs. These fibers were embedded too deeply to be incidental, and their presence in a vehicle Diana once drove led investigators to a stronger hypothesis. This was not merely passive fiber transfer, but evidence of dragging or moving someone wearing that coat inside the vehicle. The laboratory continued by analyzing compacted soil samples between the seat cushions and foreframe, a location capable of trapping soil particles from a heavy object if placed or dragged across the floor surface. The soil also matched Maple Ridge characteristics. When combining the two groups of findings, soil and fibers, the task force observed a consistent pattern. Diana's vehicle had been at Maple Ridge. The vehicle contained fibers from Evelyn's clothing, and Maple Ridge soil was present in the deepest crevices of the interior. From this, the hypothesis that Diana transported the bodies of Thomas and Evelyn using the Studebaker was no longer a lone speculation, but became a model of investigation supported by clear physical evidence. The behavioral analysis team was informed and prepared a supporting report. If Diana was the only person driving the vehicle at the time of the disappearance, and the vehicle bore direct traces of the victims, then it was highly likely the truck served as the intermediate means of moving the victims from the incident location to a disposal site, most probably within the Maple Ridge high ground area, overlooked in 1953. The final conclusion in the Section 20 report determined that samples from the Studebaker not only reinforced suspicion against Diana, but also directly connected what 1953 could not prove: the presence of the victims or their bodies in the suspect's vehicle, precisely at the location modern investigation had just demonstrated was subjected to deep soil disturbance in the past. After the analysis, results from Diana Mercer's Studebaker showed the simultaneous presence of Maple Ridge soil and fibers matching the type of Evelyn Hart's coat. The investigative team moved to the critical next step, reconstructing the entire timeline of the night of January 17, 1953, to determine whether Diana had the capability to carry out the necessary sequence of movements. This was a phase the 1953 file could not accomplish due to the lack of route simulation technology, vehicle speed modeling, and detailed time marker data. But in 2000, with software for simulating vintage vehicles and historical traffic data, the task force could recreate the journey with high accuracy. The first step was to input data for the Mercury 8 the model witness, Lester Holcomb, described seeing on the night of the disappearance into the simulation software. The average travel speed of a 1950s Mercury 8 on frozen dirt roads was determined to be approximately 25 to 32 miles per hour. On Highway 10, it ranged from 40 to 48 miles per hour, depending on snow and wind conditions. The investigative team recollected all prior statements from the group of friends who had seen Thomas and Evelyn at the Casselton dance. They left the event between approximately 10:15 and 10:30 p.m. In the old file, Diana claimed she was at home at that time, but no one could confirm it because she lived alone after the divorce, and there was no physical evidence proving her presence at home. With current data, the simulation determined that if Diana left Wheatland around 9:50 p.m., driving the Studebaker along County Road 12 and connecting to Highway 10, she could reach Casselton around 10:20 p.m., precisely the time the victims left the dance. Although there was no proof she was actually in Casselton, the simulation confirmed the route was entirely within her time capability. The second step was to determine the time required for Diana to follow or intercept Thomas and Evelyn. Assuming the hypothesis that Diana had waited in readiness on a side road near Maple Ridge High Ground, the software calculated that if the victims left Casselton at 10:30 p.m., they would reach the side road intersection around 10:55, 12:1, 7:55 to 11 p.m. Cross-referenced with Holcomb's statement that he saw the Mercury 8 turn onto the trail near midnight, the simulation produced a matching result. Travel time from the side road junction to the high ground took approximately 5 to 7 minutes. Thus, the headlights Holcomb observed most likely appeared between 11:05 and 11:10 p.m. The third step was to insert Diana's timeline into the same window to check for contradictions. Power company records showed that Diana's house consumed no household electricity from 9:30 p.m. to 1:01 a.m. that night, a detail previously dismissed as irrelevant, but now identified as perfectly aligning with the suspect's possible departure window. When the journey from Wheatland to Maple Ridge High Ground was simulated, it took approximately 40 to 45 minutes in the Studebaker, with an estimated arrival time of 10:35 to 10:40 p.m. This made the hypothesis that Diana was present in the area before the victims plausible, as she had ample time to wait in the vehicle, lights off, and observe the main road. Moreover, speed modeling showed that if Diana left the wasteland area around 11:30 p.m., after an encounter with the victims, she would reach a location where she could clean traces or conceal items by 11:50 p.m., 12:10 a.m., consistent with no witnesses reporting seeing the Studebaker on the roads in the early morning hours. The original 1953 disappearance timeline had many gaps, but when reconstructed with 2000 technology, the time fragments began to fit together in a highly suspicious manner. The time Diana left home, the time she could reach Casselton, the time the victims left the dance, the time the suspect vehicle appeared on the side road, per Holcomb, the time sufficient to carry out coercion and transport bodies to Maple Ridge. The investigative team also cross-checked the timeline against Casselton area weather data for that night. Strong northeast winds from 700 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. would have deflected sound direction, making it entirely plausible that Holcomb heard arguing voices or dragging sounds in a muffled form. Behavioral experts also analyzed that Diana's 1953 statement to police, "home all night," contained no specific verifiable details, and the near-perfect overlap between her unprovable time window and the suspect's possible access window to the scene was almost complete. Another crucial piece: the distance from the Mercer barn to Maple Ridge was a 16-minute drive in the Studebaker. If disposal occurred after the initial incident, Diana transporting the victim's personal items to the barn, either that same night or the following day, fell entirely within the simulated time frame. When the consolidated timeline report was presented, the investigative team unanimously concluded that the entire time frame of the disappearance night from the victims leaving the dance to the appearance of the Mercury 8 in Holcomb's account aligned strikingly with Diana's movement capability. No element in the simulation contradicted the hypothesis that the suspect actively followed or intercepted the victims. Instead, every calculation increased the credibility of the hypothesis that Diana herself drove the vehicle, approached the side road, and was present at Maple Ridge precisely during the window when the victims vanished from all contact. When the software generated the final report, the annotation line read, "Suspect timeline, 97% match with event trajectory based on current evidence." For the first time since 1953, a complete time model directly linked Diana Mercer to the final journey of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart. While the investigative team was finalizing the reconstruction of the disappearance night timeline and preparing an expanded survey plan for Maple Ridge High Ground, an unexpected discovery emerged from the old paper file archive at the Cass County Sheriff's Office. An archivist reviewing sealed boxes of documents from the 1950s noticed a small brown envelope wedged between two administrative file folders, not part of any official classification. The faded handwritten label was still legible: Field Notes, Henson, Jan 1953. This was the personal field notebook of Sheriff Roy Henson, who had led the initial search after Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart disappeared. In the 1953 report, Henson had only included official content, but this personal notebook had never been entered into the main file, perhaps misplaced or deliberately kept separate, because he was uncertain of its reliability. When the notebook was opened, the fourth page drew particular attention: a rough pencil sketch depicting the land west of Maple River, with an X symbol placed exactly on the slope leading up to Maple Ridge High Ground. Below it was a hurried note: tire tracks heading into high ground. Cannot confirm due to wind. Landowner refuses entry. Need paperwork. The note was boxed in red pen, as if it were an item Sheriff Henson intended to revisit. At the bottom of the page was faded writing: insufficient grounds for warrant. Wind erase tracks, temporarily set aside. This showed that Henson had once identified the very suspect area, but could not access it due to legal limitations of the era. In 1953, police were not permitted to enter private land without clear evidence of violent crime, and the disappearance of Thomas and Evelyn was not yet classified as criminal. The tire tracks Henson recorded were already very faint, insufficient to obtain a search warrant, especially since landowner Dunn refused inspection on grounds of not wanting police to disturb cultivated soil. Period records confirmed that authorities respected private property rights, and no one anticipated that refusal would inadvertently leave the key area overlooked for nearly half a century. The alignment between Henson's note and Lester Holcomb's dying statement prompted the investigative team to immediately re-examine the entire scope sketched in the old pencil map. Although Henson's sketch was simple, its accuracy was striking. When overlaid on the 2000 digitized topographic map, his exposition matched almost exactly with the bulging soil strip that the geological analysis team had recently identified as showing signs of ancient disturbance. The lead investigator remarked, "If Sheriff Henson had had 2000 technology, this case probably never would have become a cold file." This was not mere speculation, but grounded in the totality of evidence. The simulated tire tracks matched the direction of Henson's sketch. Holcomb's statement confirmed a vehicle turning onto that very trail. Soil in Diana Studebaker matched Maple Ridge soil, and Evelyn's fabric fragment appeared near that location. All the scattered details over 47 years now began to converge on a single coordinate, the coordinate Sheriff Henson had once suspected but could not investigate. Upon further review of the notebook, the team found another entry. Dunn says no one can use the old road, but fresh tire tracks before the snowstorm. This detail had never been included in the official report. Henson, likely due to lack of proof, kept it only in his personal notes. This became significant when combined with modern weather analysis. The snowstorm on the night of January 16, 1953, could have erased most tire tracks on the side road, but the remaining traces Henson recorded were likely the very Mercury 8 tracks that today's software simulation has reconstructed. The task force determined that if Henson noted fresh tire tracks before the snowstorm, it meant the suspect vehicle's journey occurred very close to the storm's passage, aligning precisely with Diana's feasible movement timeline. Another page contained a note showing Henson had planned to return for a warrant if additional witness reports surfaced. If anyone sees strange vehicle or lights on side road, Termitarian. But no witnesses came forward that year because Holcomb did not report to police. His silence lasted 47 years, causing the area to be completely excluded from search maps. Now, with Holcomb's statement obtained and forensic science providing physical evidence from Diana's vehicle, Henson's forgotten notes became the final piece confirming that this area needed re-examination. After compiling the notes, the sketched map, the new witness statement, and the vehicle trajectory reconstruction, the investigative team designated Maple Ridge High Ground as the #1 priority excavation zone. The specific location was identified as the approximately 30-yard bulging soil strip, showing anomalous compaction and the exact spot Henson had marked with an X in 1953. A combined model integrating geological data, vehicle path simulation, and historical notes was constructed, indicating an 86% probability that the area had been dug and refilled sometime in January-February 1953. This was the highest probability figure ever recorded in the reinvestigation. When Section 22 of the report was completed, the investigative team understood they were not merely following the trail of a suspect, but also completing the work Sheriff Roy Henson had attempted nearly half a century earlier, but had been prevented from pursuing by the legal and technological constraints of his era. With his sketched map in hand and new leads supporting it, they prepared to move to the decisive phase, opening the ground at Maple Ridge High Ground, where the past was finally beginning to surface. Once Maple Ridge High Ground was identified as the central point of suspicion and the chain of physical evidence, soil, fibers, jewelry, vehicle path simulation converged on the same direction. The investigative team decided the time had come to directly interview Diana Mercer. She was then 71 years old and living in Helena, Montana, after many decades away from North Dakota. A lawful summons was issued, and Diana agreed to meet with investigators with outwardly calm but clearly guarded demeanor. The interview took place at the Helena Police Station on June 18, 2000. The 1953 statement transcript was placed on the table, along with copies of newly obtained evidence. Though not presented immediately, the initial goal of the investigative team was to determine the consistency of Diana's account when compared with past records. When asked again about the night of January 17, 1953, Diana repeated nearly verbatim her original statement. She was home alone, did not go out, had no reason to go to Casselton or Wheatland. However, this time the investigators had far more data to test logic. They asked whether anyone had seen her at home from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. Diana paused briefly before answering, "No, but I didn't go anywhere." When questioned why power records showed her house consumed no electricity from 9:30 p.m. to 1 a.m., Diana explained that maybe a fuse blew, but she could not explain why she didn't remember such a multi-hour power outage on a winter night. Investigators shifted to vehicles. When asked if she still remembered the Studebaker, Diana asserted, "I sold it in 1952. But North Dakota transfer records showed the vehicle was sold in April 1953, 3 months after Thomas and Evelyn disappeared. When confronted with the registration document, Diana changed her statement, saying, "Maybe I misremembered the year." Investigators noted this as the first contradiction. Next, they asked whether Diana had ever driven a Mercury 8. She denied it completely. But Holcomb's statement describing a woman driving a Mercury 8 that night was flagged in the report. Although not yet shown to Diana, this marked the second inconsistency in her account. The next phase of the interview aimed to confront the new evidence. Investigators placed before Diana a photograph of the maple leaf hair clip found in the Mercer barn. She reacted immediately, "I've never seen that." But when asked why an item belonging to Evelyn appeared in property that only she had access to for 47 years, Diana offered no reasonable explanation, only repeating that, "Maybe someone put it there before I left." Investigators pressed, "But the barn was locked, and only you had the key." Diana breathed heavily, saying, "I don't remember," or "The barn was often unlocked." But property records and statements from land lessees since 1965 clearly stated the barn was always locked and never used by anyone other than the owner. The contradictions grew more serious when investigators presented a second photograph, the fiber sample recovered from the Studebaker. Matching the type of Evelyn's coat, Diana became visibly tense, denying any connection. Fibers could come from anyone. But investigators explained, this time calmly but sharply, that the pastel blue rayon cotton fibers in the analysis matched only the coat Evelyn wore on the night she disappeared, and their presence in the vehicle Diana used through April 1953 could not be dismissed as simple coincidence. When asked, "How do you explain fibers from the victim's clothing appearing in your vehicle?" Diana only replied, "I don't know," and fell silent. Next, investigators confronted her with a simulated vehicle speed timeline, a fact that could not be refuted by personal memory. They showed Diana the simulation proving she had sufficient time to leave Wheatland, reach Casselton as the dance ended, follow the victims, and appear on the side road at the exact time Holcomb saw the Mercury. Diana offered weak rebuttal, "Software can't know where I was." But investigators pointed out that her 1953 statement had no corroboration, no one confirmed she was home, and the time window when her house used no electricity suspiciously aligned with the victim's disappearance window. The final stage of the interview tested changes in her account. Investigators asked directly, "Why was Evelyn's jewelry, including the clip she wore that evening, found in a sealed crate in your barn?" Diana no longer looked at the photo, only saying softly, "I don't know. I didn't put them there." When asked, "Then who could have?" she answered, "No one. No one else had the key but me." The internal contradiction in her own response was recorded in the transcript. With each question, Diana grew more confused and began repeating phrases. "I don't remember. I'm not sure. I already said I don't know anything about it." This evasion, in the context of physical evidence increasingly aligning in a single direction, led the investigative team to conclude the interview and prepare the next step. The end-of-session report stated clearly, Diana Mercer's statement contained numerous contradictions compared with her 1953 account. She could not explain the appearance of evidence matching the victim's property. She could not prove her location or activities on the night of the disappearance, and she made multiple assertions contradicted by documentary facts. Overall assessment, the level of suspicion against Diana reached the threshold sufficient to consider seeking an arrest warrant, especially when combined with physical evidence, new witness testimony, and simulation data. The interview ended with the lead investigator's statement, recorded verbatim. "You have the right to remain silent, but the evidence no longer does." The investigative team left the room carrying a transcript, now dozens of pages thicker, and the legal basis to move to the next decisive phase. The interview of Diana Mercer ended with a series of major contradictions in her statements, and her inability to explain the appearance of evidence directly tied to the victim. But the investigative team could not make an immediate arrest. They first had to present a complete legal basis to the court. On June 20, 2000, the Cass County prosecutor and lead investigator held an internal legal review meeting to re-examine the entire chain of evidence and assessed the strength of each element under 2000 standards. They consolidated three main groups of evidence: physical evidence, simulation scientific evidence, and behavioral statement evidence. In the physical evidence group, investigators listed Evelyn Hart's jewelry found in the barn to which only Diana had access, fibers matching the coat Evelyn wore on the night she disappeared, present in the interior of the Studebaker Diana used throughout the winter of 1953, soil recovered from the Studebaker bed, with mineral composition matching Maple Ridge High Ground, the suspected disposal location, to a highly specific degree. This was the strongest forensic group, because it relied not on testimony or inference, but entirely on modern laboratory results. The second group, simulation and scientific evidence, included 1953 vehicle speed simulation confirming Diana's capability to move along the timeline of the incident night, simulated tire track trajectory matching the Mercury 8 she once drove, and soil fiber analysis forming a logical chain tied to Maple Ridge. The third group, behavioral evidence, included Lester Holcomb's dying statement, describing a woman driving a Mercury 8 turning onto the trail leading to Maple Ridge at the exact time the victims vanished. Sheriff Henson's lost 1953 Noke recording, fresh tire tracks before the snowstorm at that very location, contradictions in Diana's new statement compared with 1953, and the fact that she could provide no alibi evidence whatsoever. When the three groups were placed side by side, the Cass County prosecutor determined that while each element alone was insufficient for charges, together they formed a solid, interlocking chain that met the probable cause standard for an arrest warrant under North Dakota law. More importantly, the legal team emphasized the presence of the victim's personal property and the suspect's exclusive possession stored deliberately and in a manner that could not be innocently explained was the strongest legal foundation. On June 22, 2000, the Cass County Court approved an arrest warrant for Diana Mercer on the grounds of 1. Possession of personal evidence belonging to the missing victim, 2. Matching physical evidence between the vehicle and scene, 3. Contradictory and unverifiable statements, 4. Suspect timeline consistent with the course of events, mutually reinforcing circumstantial evidence indicating the suspect's access to and movement of the victims on the night of disappearance. On the morning of June 23, federal investigators and Montana local police arrived at Helena to execute the warrant. Diana was at home, wearing a light robe. Her initial expression was not panic, but disorientation, as though she could not believe this moment had arrived after nearly half a century. When the investigator read the arrest warrant aloud, Diana asked quietly, "Because of what happened in 1953?" The investigator replied, "Because of new evidence we found." Diana did not resist being handcuffed, but her demeanor changed markedly. She neither denied nor proclaimed innocence, only remained silent, eyes fixed on the floor. Some neighbors watched from a distance. Many had no prior knowledge that Diana had ever been connected to a historical disappearance case. The local church where Diana attended services was completely surprised by the news, as she had lived relatively quietly and with limited interaction. In the transport vehicle to the Montana Highway Patrol Station, Diana spoke not a single word, only occasionally asking, "What did they really find?" But investigators reminded her that all answers should be reserved for her attorney. Upon arrival at the station, Diana was photographed, fingerprinted, and processed for extradition to North Dakota. The Cass County press release issued that afternoon stated, "Suspect Diana Mercer has been arrested pursuant to a lawful warrant based on a chain of new evidence related to the 1953 disappearance of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart. This represents a significant advancement in resolving a 47-year cold case. No formal charges were read at the time of arrest, but all legal preparations were in place for the next step. Within the investigative team, no one viewed Diana's arrest as the end of the case, but had marked the transition from suspicion to formal legal action, a step that had lacked any opportunity for nearly half a century. Diana was placed in holding pending extradition proceedings, and for the first time since 1953, the disappearance of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart was no longer confined to a cold case file cabinet, but had become an active criminal investigation with a lawfully arrested suspect. Right after Diana Mercer was arrested and extradited to North Dakota, the investigative team immediately prepared for the in-depth interrogation phase, the decisive stage that could break the suspect's silence after nearly half a century. The investigators unanimously decided to apply the Reed technique, a structured interrogation method consisting of multiple steps designed to determine the degree of deception, break down defense mechanisms, and lead the suspect into a state of accepting responsibility in the face of irrefutable evidence. The interrogation took place in the interview room of the Cass County Sheriff's Office on June 26, 2000. Diana was seated in a position not directly facing the investigator to reduce initial defensiveness, while the camera recorded continuously. The first phase of the Reed process involved establishing a psychological foundation. The investigator spoke slowly about the 1953 events, emphasizing that things that happened a very long time ago can be understood differently, that many people have made mistakes in emotional circumstances, and that everyone deserves to tell their own story before the truth is misinterpreted. Diana showed no strong reaction, only looking down at her hands. But she could not hide her tension when the investigator mentioned Thomas and Evelyn as two people who were once very close to you. The second phase began when the investigator made an affirmative statement, a hallmark move of the Reed technique. We know you were near Maple Ridge that night, and we know something happened beyond your control. This was not a question, but a message intended to create the impression that the truth had already been established. Diana blinked rapidly for the first time and replied, I don't want to talk about that night. This was noted by the investigator as a signal of collapsing defenses. The third phase involved confronting the evidence item by item, a key tactic to break the suspect's general denial. The investigator placed in front of Diana a photograph of the maple leaf brooch found in the Mercer barn. No question was asked. The image was simply left silently on the table. Diana stared at the photo for nearly half a minute without speaking. Next came a photograph of a rayon cotton fiber sample matching Evelyn's coat, taken from the Studebaker interior. Then a photo of the mineral soil box matching Maple Ridge soil. Diana began to tremble, not with anger or denial, but with a form of cognitive collapse when confronted with evidence she could no longer refute. The investigator moved to the fourth step of the Reed technique, presenting two alternative explanations, one portraying the suspect's actions as malicious, the other as a mistake under stressful circumstances, in order to give the suspect an opportunity to choose the less culpable path. The investigator said, there are two possibilities. Either you planned it in advance, or you just wanted to talk, but the situation got out of control and something happened that you didn't intend. We believe it was the second one. Diana bowed her head, her hands clenched, offering no objection. This marked a significant psychological shift in the Reed model. The suspect stopped complete denial and moved into a state of accepting the event's existence. The next phase, intensifying reality, began when the investigator opened a 1953 file and placed beside it a 2000 simulated vehicle route map. He said, we know you left Wheatland at 9:50 p.m. We know you were near Casselton when the dance ended. We know the Mercury 8 turned onto the side road leading to Maple Ridge around 11:05 p.m. And we know there was a woman in the driver's seat of that car. Diana bit her lip and gave a slight nod when 11:05 p.m. was mentioned. That was the first signal of acknowledgement of her presence. The investigator seized the moment, lowering his voice. Diana, we're no longer asking if you were there. You were there. We just need to know what happened afterward. Silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then Diana whispered, I just wanted to talk to Thomas. I just wanted him to look at me. This was the first time she admitted approaching the victims that night. The investigative team recorded this as the key breakthrough point. They continued. When did things get out of control? Diana did not answer directly, but said, Evelyn shouldn't have been there. Another investigator interjected, following Reed protocol, with a leading question. Did you take them to Maple Ridge to talk privately? Diana replied, I just wanted Thomas to hear me. Then she screamed, I didn't want that. The final phase, obtaining the core confession, began when the investigator turned to the most critical question. Diana, after it happened, what did you do with them? Diana covered her face but no longer denied. They continued, offering an acceptable exit. We know you couldn't take them far. We know Maple Ridge wasn't the only place you went that night, but you didn't leave them there forever. We need to know where you took them. Diana shook her head vigorously, as if trying to suppress the memory, but when the investigator mentioned the Mercer barn, she broke into tears. The crying was soft but no longer resistant. The investigator reiterated the evidence. Maple Ridge soil, in the Studebaker, Evelyn's fibers, Sheriff Henson's note, Holcomb's statement. When the logical chain was presented, Diana completely lost the ability to refuse. Finally, she said softly, not at Maple Ridge. The investigator leaned in. Then where? Diana spoke in broken breaths. Near Tower City, the place I used to stop when driving back to Fargo, there's an old dirt pit behind a grain dryer. I left them there. This was the first statement in 47 years identifying the burial location, a completely new piece of information that had never appeared in any historical hypothesis. The investigator asked for confirmation. Near the lot behind the Tower City grain dryer? Diana nodded. The final question per protocol aimed to confirm the level of premeditation. Did you do it alone? Diana slowly nodded, without any justification. The interrogation ended at 3:42 p.m. The investigative team left the room, carrying the answer the cold case had waited half a century for. The location of the victims' bodies, an abandoned old plot of land near Tower City. A new search was about to begin. Right after Diana Mercer confessed the burial location in the area behind the Tower City grain dryer, a site that had never been searched throughout the entire investigation. The task force, in coordination with the North Dakota State Crime Lab, immediately launched the exhumation plan. That night, the Tower City topographic map was opened and cross-referenced with 1950 and 1970 aerial photographs to precisely locate the old dirt pit Diana described. According to her statement, the pit was located 200 to 250 yards south of the grain dryer tower, an area that had been agricultural wasteland before the transport road was expanded in the late 1960s. Historical photo analysis confirmed that exact spot had once contained a small waste disposal pit, operational until around 1954 and then partially filled. This was a crucial factor because it provided conditions for a secret burial in 1953 to go unnoticed. On the morning of June 27, 2000, the area was cordoned off, secured, and set up according to cold case skeletal recovery protocol. A rectangular grid coordinate system was established, divided into 1n times 1m squares, each numbered, with a diagram drawn before digging began, followed by ground-penetrating radar (GPR) survey. Although the soil in the area had been leveled multiple times, the GPR results detected two anomalous zones, differing compression from the natural soil, at depths of 70 to 100 centimeter, consistent with the typical depth of improvised burials in the 1950s when digging tools were limited. These were strong indicators of possible buried objects, and the signals did not match any old pipeline or industrial structure locations. So the team decided to test dig at grid square 14B, where the GPR signal was strongest. The forensic team used small trowels, soft brushes, and scraping tools to avoid damaging bone fragments or evidence. The first soil layer revealed fine gravel-mixed dirt characteristic of agricultural waste pits over 40 years old. The second layer showed compacted soil mixed with decomposed organic debris. At approximately 80 centimeters depth, a technician paused upon seeing a small, slightly curved, ivory-white bone fragment, a human adult rib. The forensic team leader immediately signaled to stop mechanical digging and switch entirely to manual excavation. The discovery of the first bone confirmed the location matched the confession, but the process had to continue to determine the full burial extent. After expanding square 14B in two directions, the forensic team located the remainder of the ribcage and spine, oriented toward the northeast. The articulated bone segments indicated the body had been placed on its side, not in a traditional burial position. This was consistent with patterns commonly seen in illicit disposals. As the team cleared the soil around the skull area, they found a smaller, more delicate jawbone, highly likely belonging to Evelyn. Positive identification, however, was reserved for later DNA analysis. While expanding the area northwest along the second GPR signal, just minutes later, the forensic team discovered a larger femur with thicker cortical bone consistent with an adult male structure. Digging deeper revealed the pelvis and remaining spine, buried roughly parallel to the first set of remains, but about 1.4 meters apart. The fact that the two bodies were buried close but not in the same pit suggested hasty yet deliberately adjusted burial to avoid creating an overly large, noticeable hole. Burial depths for both were similar, ranging from 78 to 92 centimeters from the 2000 ground surface, judged consistent with natural settling and soil compaction over decades. Notably, the overlying soil layer on both locations had a finer composition different from the surrounding native soil, indicating transported fill dirt, a hallmark of concealment burials. While the forensic team continued, investigators noted a small metal object near the second set of remains, a lightly corroded brass shirt button, with an engraved pattern matching the shirt Thomas Brandt was described as wearing the night he disappeared. This data increased confidence that the second set of remains belonged to Thomas. Additionally, near the first set, the team found a small pastel blue fabric fragment material previously confirmed to match Evelyn's coat. Though small, the fragment was sufficient to link the remains to the female victim. After nearly 6 hours of careful excavation, both sets of remains were fully recovered using modern forensic methods, placed in specialized body bags, assigned coded numbers, and transported to the North Dakota State Forensic Laboratory for identification, trauma analysis, and examination of any surviving traces on the bones. Before leaving the scene, the investigative team reconstructed the entire burial site imagery, measured pit dimensions, recorded orientation, depth, and surrounding soil structure. All information was digitized and entered into the case file for comparison with Diana's statement. The excavation site report concluded 2 human skeletal sets were recovered at the location exactly as Diana confessed, within the old dirt pit area behind the Tower City grain dryer, at depths consistent with a 1953 burial based on decomposition level, soil structure, and mineral stratification. For the first time since their disappearance, the remains of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart were found, ending nearly half a century of vanishing without a trace. At the North Dakota State Forensic Laboratory, the 2 skeletal sets were entered into prioritized cold case analysis protocol, beginning with dental examination and skeletal feature survey to establish identity before proceeding to trauma assessment. The first set, recovered from the position closer to the southern boundary of the old dirt pit, was taken to the odontology section, where specialists immediately compared jaw arch structure, tooth root shapes, eruption angles, and enamel wear patterns against Thomas Brandt's archived 1951 dental records. Although dental records from that era were limited, consisting of only 2 x-rays and a local Fargo dentist's notes, the distinctive features of Thomas, including slightly overlapping upper incisors, an old silver filling on tooth number 14, and a 2 mm leftward deviation of the lower jaw, all matched precisely on the remains. Notably, the silver filling on the upper right molar showed corrosion consistent with 1940s dental techniques, fully aligning with the medical file description. This allowed the forensic team to conclude with near absolute certainty that the first set of remains belonged to Thomas Brandt. Concurrently, the second set was taken to the anthropological identification room. This smaller, more graceful skeleton exhibited female adult morphological traits. Specialists analyzed pelvic curvature, sciatic notch width, lumbar curvature, long bone dimensions, and developmental markers to determine sex, age, and stature. Results indicated a female aged 25 to 35, height approximately 5'4", 5'5", 1163 or 166 centimeters, fully consistent with Evelyn Hart's 1953 missing persons description. Further comparison was made using medical records of Evelyn, including a left wrist fracture from a staircase fall in 1949. Analysis of the left radius and ulna revealed an old healed fracture line matching the described injury exactly. Additionally, mild degenerative changes in the lumbar vertebrae aligned with family doctor notes that Evelyn worked in administration and frequently experienced mild lower back pain. This chain of indicators was strong enough to conclude that the second set of remains belonged to Evelyn Hart. To provide absolute confirmation, the lab extracted samples from teeth and femurs of both sets for mitochondrial DNA analysis, suitable for long decomposed remains. Although nuclear DNA was heavily degraded, mitochondrial DNA was sufficiently preserved for comparison with living maternal line relatives. Results showed the male remains matched the Brandt family maternal line, while the female remains matched the Hart family maternal line. This sequence of examinations completed the scientific and irrefutable identification process. Once identity was confirmed, the case file was upgraded from a dual missing persons case of 1953 to an officially identified homicide case. The Cass County Sheriff's Office immediately updated the case classification, activating homicide investigation procedures for cold cases under 2000 legal guidelines. This transition meant all previously collected evidence, fibers, torn paper scraps, tire impressions, soil adhering to Diana's old truck, jewelry found in the Mercer barn was now incorporated into a mandatory chain of evidence and reanalyzed with a new focus on tracing injuries, determining cause of death mechanisms, and reconstructing motive. With the 2 sets of remains identified through dental, anthropological, and DNA methods, the investigation overcame one of the largest barriers that had stalled the case in 1954, the complete absence of the victims. From this point, all investigative avenues continued to expand under the status of an identified homicide, with the primary suspect officially in custody, pending prosecution. After the identities of the two skeletal sets were confirmed and the case officially reclassified from missing persons to homicide, the investigative team restructured the entire sequence of events by integrating historical statements, scientific examinations, and newly collected physical evidence to construct a complete timeline from the Casselton dance to the point Diana Mercer disposed of the bodies near Tower City. First, authorities established the initiating timeline. On the evening of December 17, 1953, Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart left the dance around 11:15 p.m., according to friends who attended with them. The couple was last seen leaving the parking lot in a light blue Plymouth heading along Highway 10, consistent with their usual route back to Wheatland. This was the last confirmed time they were seen alive. Approximately 15 and 20 minutes later, per the 2000 deathbed statement of a witness, that person heard a second vehicle speed onto the southern dirt side road near Maple Ridge, accompanied by intense arguing. Cross-referenced maps showed this direction led to the area where faint tire tracks and disturbed soil were later discovered, aligning with the route Diana could have taken. Evidence collected in 1953 faint tire impressions near the intersection and residual soil samples from the road edge was re-examined using 2000 digital simulation technology, indicating the impressions matched the type of truck Diana owned at the time. Additionally, soil analysis from the interior of Diana's old truck matched the soil type for Maple Ridge High Ground, an area previously overlooked because it was private land and was later the site where police found ancient digging disturbances. From this, the investigative team concluded that the two vehicles did not meet by chance. Diana's act of following the couple after they left the dance was the initiating step in the chain of events leading to the crime. Expanding the comparison of statements, police found numerous inconsistencies in Diana's 1953 account. She claimed to have been home all evening, but travel time simulations using 1953 vehicle speeds showed Diana could have left Fargo, reached Casselton, followed Thomas's car, forced them to stop on the Maple Ridge dirt road, and returned home within the time frame she herself reported. Next, the team incorporated minor pieces of evidence into the logical chain. Fabric recovered near site number 1 matched Evelyn's coat. Faint shoe impressions matched average women's shoe sizes of the era and did not match Thomas's shoe size. A torn scrap of paper with handwriting similar to letters Diana wrote during her divorce period, confirmed by handwriting analysis, indicated her presence at a point directly linked to the victims. When these disparate pieces of evidence were placed within the same timeline, they formed a clear connected sequence. Diana followed, intercepted, and argument ensued. She forced the victims out of their vehicle, assaulted them at an undetermined location, then transported both in her truck to the high ground at Maple Ridge, where she dug a temporary burial pit, and in 1954, returned to regrade the soil a second time to conceal it. The discovery of Evelyn's personal jewelry in the old Mercer family barn provided the final piece driving the incriminating conclusion. It not only proved Diana had contact with the victims after their disappearance, but also showed she retained possession of incriminating personal items, something inexplicable absent criminal conduct. Physical, circumstantial, and contextual evidence combined to form a highly consistent reconstruction of the crime night sequence. The investigative team's conclusion stated, Diana Mercer had the means, the opportunity, strong motive, presence at key locations, possession of incriminating items, and could provide no reasonable explanation for any trace connected to her. This constituted a case file with sufficient legal foundation to present to the prosecutor for advancement of criminal prosecution proceedings. The criminal trial in 2000 at Cass County Court began with special attention from the legal community due to the complexity of a cold case spanning nearly half a century, where the entire prosecution rested on a tightly structured chain of circumstantial evidence, unified and reinforced by modern forensic technology. The prosecutor opened by representing the timeline of events from the Casselton dance to the disposal of the bodies at Maple Ridge High Ground, emphasizing that every link in the chain of events connected directly to Diana Mercer's presence and actions. This formed the core of the prosecution's argument. No single trace appeared disconnected from Diana, and no trace suggested the reasonable existence of an alternative suspect. First, the prosecution introduced evidence examined with 2000 technology. Soil samples from the interior of Diana's old truck matched the unique soil type at the burial site. Fibers recovered near site number 1 matched the fabric of Evelyn's coat. Evelyn's personal jewelry was found in the Mercer barn, with no reasonable explanation from the defendant. The prosecutor stressed that these pieces of evidence, though circumstantial when placed within the same timeline and location, formed a chain of exclusion so strong that it far exceeded mere speculation and approached the level of impossible to have occurred by chance. Next, the prosecution presented simulations of 1953 vehicle speeds and the faint tire tracks at Maple Ridge, proving that only the type of truck Diana owned at the time matched the tread width and spacing. They concluded that Diana was present at the dirt road intersection at the exact time a witness reported hearing arguing and the sounds of two vehicles. The prosecution also introduced the dying witness's statement. Though the witness saw no person or license plate, but the description matched the sound profile of the truck Diana drove: large engine, distinctive muffler tone, and the characteristic suspension rattle of an old vehicle. The prosecution then placed the 1953 historical file in context. Diana had previously exhibited stalking behavior toward Thomas and Evelyn, had driven to small towns around Casselton at night, and had openly displayed extreme jealousy in letters and conversations with multiple acquaintances. They emphasized that this was not inferred motive, but a repeated behavioral pattern consistent with the events of the disappearance night. The next step in the prosecution's argument was an analysis of inconsistencies in statements. By comparing Diana's 1953 statements with her 2000 statements, the prosecution identified four major inconsistencies: the time she left home, her claimed route of never leaving the city, the location where her truck was parked that evening, and her assertion that she owned none of Evelyn's possessions. Each inconsistency was proven by physical evidence or old investigative notes, rendering the defendant's statements seriously unreliable. Finally, the prosecution concluded its presentation with a synthesizing argument. No link in the chain of evidence against Diana was broken. No sign suggested the involvement of a second suspect, and no evidence contradicted the prosecution's hypothesis. The entire sequence from following, pursuing, intercepting, coercing, killing, and disposing aligned perfectly with the remaining traces. Despite the long passage of time, the defense, representing Diana, countered with a strategy focused on the case's core weakness. No direct eyewitness saw Diana on the night of the disappearance, and there was no conclusive evidence such as fingerprints or DNA at the scene due to the severe limitations of 1953 forensic capabilities. The defense argued that any logical pattern could be misinterpreted without direct data, and that items such as soil, fibers, and jewelry could have been transferred, found, or planted in ways not fully considered. They also attempted to undermine the dying witness's statement, arguing that memory in the final stages of life can be unreliable. They further highlighted that the 1953 file initially did not place Diana strongly enough in the suspect category, implying that if clear evidence had existed then, she would have been arrested long ago. This strategy aimed to instill in the jury a sense that the case might have been read in one direction, especially in the absence of direct evidence. However, the prosecution rebutted by demonstrating that the heart of the case lay not in the existence of direct witnesses, but in the inexplicable consistency of the chain of circumstantial evidence when placed within the same framework. In close deliberations, the jury had to consider two key questions: whether the chain of circumstantial evidence was strong enough to exclude every reasonable hypothesis of innocence, and whether Diana's statement inconsistencies fell within the bounds of natural memory error or demonstrated intentional concealment. After many hours of analysis, the jury cross-referenced each piece of evidence against the reconstructed timeline: vehicle positions, tire direction, jewelry, soil samples, history of conflict, torn paper scrap, fibers, travel time matches, and concluded that the entire chain of evidence was not only logical, but left no reasonable gap for an innocence hypothesis. Their high regard for the file's coherence, where each piece reinforced every other, showed that the decisive factor was not direct evidence, but the level of interconnection, exclusion of randomness, and compatibility of all data with a single scenario. Diana Mercer was responsible for the deaths of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart. As the trial entered its final phase, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy and thick, as though nearly half a century of waiting for a final answer had converged into this single moment. After many hours of closed deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with grave faces. No one looked at the defendant or the victims' families. They carried the demeanor of people who had reached a difficult but unavoidable decision. The judge instructed everyone to rise as the foreperson was asked the final procedural question: has the jury reached a verdict? The jury foreperson replied, "Yes, Your Honor," in a calm but taut voice. The handwritten verdict slip was handed to the judge and read aloud to the entire courtroom, each word ringing clear and irrevocable. We, the jury in this case, based on all the circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, testimony, and forensic analysis, find the defendant Diana Mercer guilty of second-degree murder in the deaths of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a great crack, sealing 47 years of questioning and doubt. Diana stood motionless, expression unchanged, but her hands gripped the edge of the defense table until they turned white. Her attorney lightly touched her elbow, but she did not respond. Diana's gaze remained fixed straight ahead, not in defiance, but in the complete collapse of a story she had tried to preserve unchanged throughout her adult life. The jury was discharged and left the courtroom in absolute silence, leaving the judge to proceed with sentencing according to procedure. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence under the sentencing guidelines, life imprisonment without parole, based on the severity of the conduct killing two people, long-term body disposal, concealment of the truth, and obstruction of justice spanning nearly half a century. The defense attempted to argue for mitigation, stressing that the case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence and that the defendant had no prior violent record. But the judge interrupted with the observation that the degree of intent in the crime could not be minimized simply because of the lack of direct witnesses or the long passage of time. After several minutes reviewing the factors under North Dakota state law, the judge delivered the final decision. She affirmed that, based on the jury's verdict and the logical interconnection of the evidence, the defendant not only caused the deaths of two people but deliberately concealed the crime by burying the bodies deep in the ground, forcing the victims' families to live in uncertainty and pain for decades. The cruelty lay not in a single impulsive act, but in the persistent, intentional concealment of the aftermath. The judge declared, for 2 counts of second-degree murder, the court sentences the defendant, Diana Mercer, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was final and resounding, like the last lock closing a sentence across time. Diana closed her eyes for a moment, showing no strong reaction, but that silence made the moment even heavier. She was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom, walking slowly, but without resistance. She did not turn to look at anyone, not her relatives, not the prosecution, not the victims' families, not the reporters noting her every movement. In that instant, Diana's silence was no longer denial, but a form of forced acceptance. Every effort to preserve the old story had collapsed under the weight of evidence that could no longer be ignored. For the families of Thomas and Evelyn, there was no cheering, no flood of tears, only a soft, long, deep sigh from people who had lived nearly half their lives with an unanswered question. For them, the verdict was not revenge, but the closing of a long chapter of loss, while finally opening the possibility for the 2 victims to rest in peace as individuals whose lives were legally recognized as having been taken, rather than as undefined names in a missing persons file. As Diana was led through the door, her figure gradually disappeared. But the rest of the story, the impact this case had on the community, the consequences for trust and fear, had not yet ended. When the life sentence for Diana Mercer officially closed the nearly half-century-old case, North Dakota investigators conducted a full debrief of the entire case-solving process to draw core lessons on handling cold cases, especially in the context of a 1953 disappearance resolved only through the combination of small physical evidence, investigative persistence, and advances in 2000 forensic technology. The first factor emphasized was the value of small evidence fragments that seemed meaningless in the early days of the search. Wind-blown fabric scraps, faint shoe prints on the dirt road edge, partially snow-covered tire tracks, the torn paper scrap recovered near site number 1, all had once been deemed too small, too vague to advance the investigation. Yet these became crucial anchors once technology advanced enough for deeper analysis. This chain of small evidence formed the foundation for reconstructing behavior, routes, and points of intersection between victims and perpetrator. The lesson drawn: no evidence is small if the investigative context remains unresolved. The investigator's duty is to preserve, document, and archive accurately so future generations can decode it with new technology. The initial errors in the 1953 search, particularly overlooking the Maple Ridge High Ground area due to confusion over private land boundaries and inaccurate topographic maps, were seen as a major factor prolonging the case for decades. Reanalysis of the files showed that the 1953 search team focused primarily on the main highway and areas around Maple River, missing the higher, obscured, and harder-to-access location. This was a systemic error of the era, when investigative forces lacked precise mapping tools, 3D terrain analysis capability, and legal authority to search private land without warrants. From this error, agencies drew a strategic lesson: any area, no matter how difficult to access or outside familiar boundaries, could become a disposal site. Caution in defining search perimeters is vital, but the most decisive factor, the one that enabled the case to be solved in 2000, was the dramatic advancement of forensic technology. 3 fields played determining roles: spectroscopy, digital simulation, and mitochondrial DNA. Spectroscopy confirmed that fibers recovered in 1953 matched Evelyn's coat, despite time-induced degradation. Digital simulation reconstructed Diana's truck route based on faint tire tracks, something 1953 to 1954 police could not manually calculate. And mitochondrial DNA, though not as powerful as nuclear DNA, was sufficient to confirm the identity of the 2 skeletal sets, breaking the 47-year wall of mystery caused by the absence of bodies. Legal experts concluded that without 2000 technology, the case would have been virtually unsolvable, even with full preservation of small evidence and witness statements. This case became a textbook example of the importance of maintaining cold case archives, a hidden treasure that can be unlocked when technology permits. In the final summary report, investigators reconstructed the complete story. Thomas and Evelyn left the dance, were followed by Diana, intercepted on the Maple Ridge dirt road, cursed out of their vehicle, killed in the short window between midnight and dawn, their bodies transported in Diana's truck to the high ground and buried deep under the cold North Dakota soil. The Plymouth was left without accident damage or major disturbance, a sign of coercion rather than voluntary departure. The once scattered pieces of evidence finally merged into a consistent, seamless picture. When the summary report was signed, the final line read, "The disappearance of December 17, 1953, was resolved in August 2000. Evidence collected, analyzed, and cross-referenced across 4 generations of investigators confirmed second-degree murder committed by Diana Mercer. The file is closed as fully solved." This closure not only resolved the story of 2 people who vanished in 1953, but also became a symbol of the enduring power of justice delayed by 47 years, yet still able to emerge with the support of knowledge, technology, and the unrelenting persistence of investigators. The North Dakota 1953 story you have just followed reflects an important truth of modern American life. The passage of time does not diminish the value of truth, and justice, however delayed, must still be pursued with persistence, precision, and faith in progress. The disappearance of Thomas Brandt and Evelyn Hart shows how initial oversights, such as missing the Maple Ridge high ground area, or undervaluing small evidence like fibers and faint tire tracks, can leave an investigation stalled for decades. In today's American society, this lesson applies not only to law enforcement, but to any field involving decision-making. Details that seem trivial, a forgotten data point, an overlooked note, a contradictory statement can sometimes completely change the final outcome. The persistence of the 2000 investigators, especially when they re-examined fibers with spectroscopy, simulated tire tracks, or matched mitochondrial DNA to identify victims, reminds us that scientific and technological progress is a crucial tool for overcoming the limitations of the past. In contemporary American society, where fields from healthcare and education to technology all depend on data and analysis, updating knowledge, leveraging new tools, and regularly revisiting old conclusions are indispensable. Finally, the story of Diana Mercer is also a warning. The truth can be hidden for many years, but violent, controlling, and obsessive behavior never truly disappears. It only waits to be exposed. This reminds us that in personal life, recognizing toxic signs in relationships, such as extreme jealousy or stalking, must be taken seriously and addressed early through law or community intervention. Justice that arrives late is still better than justice that never arrives. But to prevent tragedies like the one in North Dakota, today's American society needs to be more proactive in listening, reporting, and addressing dangerous behavior from the moment it first appears. Thank you for following this 47-year journey to solve the disappearance. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next Cold Case Files. See you in the next video, where we continue to explore how justice finds its way back, even after being buried by time.